There have been a lot of title belts throughout wrestling history, and of course a lot of these belts have been very eye-catching, with designs such as the Winged Eagle WWF title and the Big Gold Belt from WCW being amongst the most beloved by fans. But what about the flip side to this? What about the belts which stood out for being such an eyesore? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the red and blue Universal titles. Yes, if the old Winged Eagle belt was loved by the previous generation of fans, then the reason for that was because it looked beautiful, like something the champion of a sport would proudly wear around his waist. Unfortunately though, as the years went on, we got rid of that design and eventually moved on to what we got with the Universal title designs. Why were these belts such jarring colors? Well, because they needed to be able to shout very loudly about what brand they represented. Yes, Vince McMahon wanted fans to clearly know if the Universal title was being defended on Raw when it was held by Brock Lesnar or Seth Rollins, or if it was being defended on SmackDown when Roman Reigns was in the midst of his 1,316-day run with it, so he gave each belt their own color code. So it should come as no surprise that both of these belt designs were largely reviled by many fans, with the red one being the subject of particular vitriol when it was first unveiled during a match between Seth Rollins and Finn Balor at SummerSlam 2016. Fortunately though, in the years since then, the Universal title has been formally merged with the WWE title after Cody Rhodes won it at WrestleMania 40, meaning we don't have to worry about seeing its crazy color schemes on our screens anytime in the near future in either of its incarnations. But of course, the red and blue versions of the Universal title aren't the only ones which existed over the 8 years that belt was active. No, there was at one point a special customized version made for one of its holders, and that belt is our next entry as it happens. Yes, we're talking about the Fiend belt. Yes, the Fiend's customized version of the Universal title truly was ugly. But to be fair, it really was supposed to look this way, as it was being carried by a horror movie villain-inspired character after all. What was so ugly about it exactly? Well, rather than have the WWE logo on the front of it, this one instead just had a big picture of the Fiend's face on it, with nothing else to really signify that it was the top prize on SmackDown at the time. Sure, horror fans may have enjoyed this one to an extent, as it certainly looked gruesome, and if you were a major fan of the Fiend gimmick, then you might have even been able to find something to like about his face being stretched out across the gold. But for most other fans, it was a disaster of a design. Thankfully though, the Fiend's version of the Universal title would at least be short-lived, as when he dropped it in February of 2020, it disappeared forever. But the same cannot be said of our next entry, because back during the Attitude Era and the beginnings of the Ruthless Aggression Era, it lived on for several years in several different incarnations. What are we talking about this time? Why, the Hardcore title, of course. Now, you could argue that the whole point of the Hardcore title was that it was supposed to be ugly. After all, it was meant to represent the Hardcore division, a division which, in turn of the Millennium WWF, was all about weapons, plunder matches, and wild brawls. But that doesn't change the fact that even if it was by design, it was still a very ugly belt. Sure, it may have been pretty at some point in time, as at some point this was actually a replica of the old Winged Eagle belt, with one of the most popular misconceptions out there being that it was the one Mr. Perfect so famously smashed up with a hammer on TV once. But by the time it made it back to television in November of 1998, it certainly wasn't pretty anymore. And that's because, as the myth surrounding its birth suggests, it was a belt which had been brutally broken and torn apart, with anything that had once been regal about it now being long gone. Still, even if it wasn't very nice to look at, the Hardcore title did become a regularly fought over possession during this era of WWF. Hell, over the course of its existence, it would actually change hands a full 231 times, with most of these title changes happening under 24/7 rules. In fact, so beloved would it be by some of the people who held it, at one point towards the end of its life, the Hardcore title even began to get some customized versions introduced, with two of the most notable of these being Tommy Dreamer's and Bradshaw's. Why were these so notable? Well, because they somehow looked even crazier than the original version. That's right, when the innovator of violence introduced his own version of the strap during the early 2000s, it would have a New York City license plate pasted over the front face plate. And when Bradshaw did the same at around the same time, his would have a Texas flag. But then the division was very much in its death throes at this time, ready to be put out to pasture once and for all. Of course, once it was gone and the Hardcore title was gone along with it, there were still plenty of bad belt designs to come, with one of these being our next entry, the spiritual successor to the Hardcore title, the 24/7 title. Yes, it was back in May of 2019 that in an attempt to boost flatlining Raw ratings, Vince McMahon decided that the best way to get some interest back for that third hour of Raw was for it to serve as a stomping ground for a new version of the old Hardcore division. But this one wouldn't be called the Hardcore division. Rather, it would be called the far more PG-friendly 24/7 division, with its title being the 24/7 title. Why was it the 24/7 title? Well, like with the belt which preceded it, this one was going to be fought over under 24/7 rules, meaning that so long as you had a referee with you, you could challenge the champion for it at any time, in any place, even if that be somewhere like a golf course, a private jet, or a bathroom. And while this could have led to some fun moments, the belt's design never quite got over with audiences, as it was such an eyesore to look at. Yes, this new prize had a green leather strap with a copper penny centerpiece, with it looking similar to something you would have got at a Toys R Us back in the day. Not the kind of thing which should have been presented as an actual piece of hardware people wanted to fight over on TV. So perhaps it should come as little surprise then that pretty quickly this belt became something of a comedy title, with the majority of its existence seeing it be held by R-Truth and defended during comedy segments, which usually ended with him running away from the jobber crew of 205 Live or Main Event. Even the most hardcore of fans would struggle to defend this one, and when Triple H clearly saw the division wasn't getting over as initially intended, he'd deactivate the title and make sure it was gone forever, when the final champion Nikki Cross quite literally dumped it in the trash on an episode of Raw. But that somehow wasn't the only time WWE ever did copper penny designs for a title belt. No, years before, they'd do the exact same thing with our next entries, the WWE Tag Team titles from the 2010s. Yes, the copper tag team titles were originally introduced back in August of 2010. And WWE had the best of intentions with this design, as they were going for something which was supposed to look like it was straight out of ancient Greece, complete with Spartan helmets on the front faceplate, the exact kind of thing the gladiators of old might have fought over. But in practice, we can all safely look back on it now and say that it looked like the tag team champions were wearing giant pennies around their waists. That's right, whether it was The Shield, The New Day, The Usos, or even the Rhodes Brothers, all of the great tag team champions from that era had to be seen wearing this design at some point. And that understandably made them all look a little less cool whenever they were walking down to the ring or were holding their gold aloft after a hard-fought title defense. This one truly was a Hall of Fame worthy bad design, one which is still maligned by many fans to this day, especially whenever people remember it once had its own red and blue brand specific versions too. Still, at least things have been rectified now, because as of 2024, a redesign has seen things look a lot better for the titles, with the World Tag Team Championships still having that circular design as before, but now in a far more beautiful way. But enough about the men's titles for now, as they're not the only ones which have been bad at times over the years. No, there have been plenty of bad-looking women's belts too, and one of the most notable of these would be our next entry, that being the Divas title. Come on now, you all remember this one. It was the one that was often known as the butterfly belt on account of that butterfly-style faceplate it had. Really, aside from just being a bad design, a big part of the reason this one is as disliked as it is today is because it was representative of a down period for women's wrestling. Yes, this was the period where women were not taken as seriously as they are today, and given how little care was given to the division by WWE management back then, it perhaps shouldn't come as any surprise that the design for the belt was given the same amount of time and attention. Seemingly then, this is how we ended up with the butterfly belt. Sure, there were talented women who held the Divas title during the years it was active, names like Natalya, AJ Lee, and Paige. But any hopes they had of being taken seriously as top-level stars on the level of the men were always hurt by the fact that this was the belt they had to carry around with them whenever they were on top of the division. Thankfully then, when things began to change for the women of WWE following the rise of the Four Horsewomen during the mid-2010s, a decision was made to change things up with the belt too. And that change was to get rid of the Divas branding and instead return it to being the women's division, where they would fight over a women's title, with the last holder of the old butterfly belt being Charlotte Flair. But that shouldn't suggest that the women's title hasn't had its fair share of bad designs over the years too. In fact, one of them is our next entry, the Lay Cool split version of the strap. That's right. In order to explain, let us first take you back to the summer of 2010. That was the point where there were 2 women's titles on the WWE roster, with one being the WWE Women's title and the other being the WWE Divas title. As time went on though, and Vince McMahon felt he didn't need more than one prize in the division, he decided to unify the 2 belts during a match between then champions Melina and Michelle McCool at Night of Champions on September 19th of that year. Who would win this one? Well, that would be Michelle McCool. But she wouldn't be the only one defending the now unified belt at this point. No, now she'd share the duty with her LayCool tag team partner, Layla. Why was that? Well, because Layla felt like, given how much she'd helped her partner to get the win, which saw her be a double champion, she deserved her part of the prize too. And this led to the pair getting into a backstage argument over who was the real champ then, with their subsequent tug of war over the belt seeing it be ripped in 2. Yeah, you heard us right, the women's title was now broken into 2 separate pieces, one for each of the members of LayCool. So for the next couple of months, each time LayCool came down to the ring to defend their belt, both Michelle McCool and Layla would be carrying one half of the desecrated straps over their shoulders. Still, it could have been worse. It could have been the design of our next entry, another true wild design to come out of the PG era of WWE. What are we talking about this time? What else but Edge's Rated R Spinner Belt. Yes, while the spinner belt might be more closely associated with John Cena, at least that version was popular amongst a certain section of the audience. And that one certainly suited the superstar it was designed for specifically, with all its hip-hop culture-inspired elements included. When it came to Edge's version though, the one that he introduced in August of 2006 after winning it from Big Match John, the same couldn't be said. Why was that? Well, this version also spun, but when it did, it wasn't a WWE logo which was doing the spinning. No, it was a big Rated R logo instead. And yes, this was the point in that it was supposed to make you dislike it and want to boo it. Hell, the plan may have been to make fans miss the original John Cena spinner belt so much that when it finally came back, they'd begin to love it, but none of these changes the fact that it was a design most fans just didn't like. Sure, it may have only lasted around a month before Big Match John won the belt back and banished this away forever, but it says something about how wild looking it was that even now, this many years on, many fans still consider it one of the worst title designs in history. That's quite an achievement, especially when it's being directly compared to the spinner belt. Honestly, if we were to rank all the things that Edge had been responsible for throughout his wrestling career in a scale that has the tables, ladders, and chairs matches somewhere near the top, this would be close to the bottom, if not outright dead last. But Edge wasn't the only person who had their own ugly custom version of a world title made over the years. In fact, he wasn't even the only member of those iconic TLC matches who had this, because the same would happen with Jeff Hardy a few years later in 2010, though when it happened to him, it wouldn't be in WWE, rather it would be in TNA with his Immortal belt. Now we all know that Jeff Hardy is a very creative guy. It's been a big part of his appeal ever since he first became famous during the Attitude Era, in fact. After all, if you were an alternative kid back then, or in any other time period for that matter, then it's easy to identify with the unique guy who likes nothing more than to express himself in unique ways, be that through music, painting, or throwing his body around like a crash test dummy. Sure, calling the way he performed in some of his most insane matches art might seem wild at first glance, but there was certainly an artistry to what he did back then, and that artistry would continue once he left WWE behind and joined the TNA roster. That said, for as much as we'd come to expect weird things from the charismatic enigma at this point, the one thing we didn't expect from him was that he'd get one of the strangest looking custom title belt designs when he finally won the big one down in the Impact Zone in 2010. But then maybe we shouldn't have been surprised about this, because for as much as we love Jeff, his ideas can be pretty out there sometimes, and they don't always hit a home run. What was the design of this one exactly? Well, it was some spiky, pointed design that had the visage of Brother Nero on the front faceplate, though to be honest, we can't be 100% sure of that, as it isn't exactly a great likeness of him. Then, of course, there's the color of the strap, with this being purple, with this only adding on to the strangeness of this design. Sure, like with the Rated R spinner belt, you could argue that this one was meant to get heel heat, as it came during a period when the charismatic Enigma had just been inducted into the ranks of the heel group Immortal, alongside the likes of Eric Bischoff, Hulk Hogan, and Jeff Jarrett, with this being why it's so commonly known as the Immortal title. But again, like with the Rated R spinner belt, that doesn't change the fact that it's still an eyesore of a design. And it's not as if TNA didn't have the ability to make a better design at the time. No, back in 2010, the wealthy Carter family owned the promotion, so there really is no excuse in that respect. One promotion we can somewhat excuse for making a cheap-looking title, however, is our next subject, as it's in Extreme Championship Wrestling, everyone's favorite low-budget underdog that we find another bad belt design, that of the original FTW title. Now, modern wrestling fans will probably be more aware of the FTW title today as being an unsanctioned belt which was, up until recently, fought over in AEW, with the man who held it the most probably being Hook. But years before it ever got a second life down in Jacksonville, the FTW title was first created by Hook's father, current AEW commentator, Taz. Why had Taz created a belt for himself? Well, after growing frustrated that he'd been unable to challenge Shane Douglas for the ECW World title following Douglas's injury, the Human Suplex Machine decided that if he couldn't win the official belt, then he'd just make an unofficial one for himself. And that's what led to him creating the FTW title. The only problem with the FTW title, though, was that, apart from never being officially sanctioned by ECW, it was ugly to look at. And that was because it was about as cheap looking as they came, with it basically seeming to be some kind of replica version of the Winged Eagle belt, complete with a bright orange strap. And yes, the orange did serve a purpose, as it was the color most associated with Taz, but it was still garish nonetheless. Of course, the ugliness of the belt very well could have been a part of the design here, and not in the sense that it was supposed to get heel heat. No, we can't rule out the idea that it was grimy and ugly looking specifically because that was what ECW was. So if it didn't look like something you would get in WWF or WCW, that was okay, as this was exactly at what fans of Extreme Championship Wrestling wanted. But while we can give the original FTW title a pass for not looking great, as it was very possibly supposed to be that way, the same can't be said for our next entry. No, when it came to those early days of NXT as a true developmental league, they almost certainly wanted a title which made them look like they were prestigious. And that was not something we quite got with the original NXT title. Yes, while the NXT title has looked great over the years, with the black and gold version being particularly well liked by audiences, it took a while for WWE to figure out the design of it. But then, to be fair to them, back when it was first introduced in 2012, the creative team were probably spread thin already, trying to make sure the brand successfully moved over from the game show incarnation into something that would be more sustainable as a place for wrestlers to learn before eventually moving up to the main roster. And that was how, rather than get one of the better versions that we're all familiar with today, when Seth Rollins became the inaugural NXT World Champion on July 26th of that year, he'd be given something which, to put it nicely, wasn't exactly pretty to look at. No, while it did have the NXT logo right there front and center as later versions would, the rest of the design left a lot to be desired. And as if that weren't bad enough, there was also the fact that rather than have some cool side plates placed along the strap to make up for the center of the title, all we got here were a bunch of square WWE logos, with there being no nameplate at all to celebrate whoever was holding the title at the time. Thankfully though, when it comes to the top prize in NXT, it would get far better designs as the years went on and the brand started to take off in popularity, and so for this reason we can safely say today that it's been redeemed. That said, none of this takes away from the fact that the original design wasn't the best. But then, we guess the same could be said about every title belt we've looked at today, as they're all amongst the worst designs that wrestling has ever given us. One thing that wrestling fans have always loved to see is a great belt design. After all, if this is a prize that the top wrestlers in the industry are fighting over, then it should be something which is beautiful to look at. So whenever a belt comes along that's particularly eye-catching, then audiences rain down love upon it. But which are the best looking belts in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the Winged Eagle version of the WWF title. Yes, if you were asking most fans to name one belt design which stands above all others as the greatest ever, then it would probably be the Winged Eagle version of the WWF title. But then, why wouldn't this be the case, as it's a beautiful piece of artwork, one which was instantly beloved by fans as soon as it was first introduced in 1988. Of course, back then, the holder of this belt was Hulk Hogan, but he wouldn't be the only person to carry such an iconic design around his waist. No, over the years, others such as Macho Man Randy Savage, Ric Flair, Shawn Michaels, and Bret Hart would also proudly hold on to it. In fact, so synonymous would the Hitman become with the Winged Eagle throughout the mid-90s, for many fans, it's him who they think of first when they think of it, not the Hulkster. Yes, so timeless was this belt and its design, what with it having that iconic eagle spreading its wings on the front faceplate, it made pretty much everyone who ever held it look like a true champion. Unfortunately though, as with all good things, the time of the Winged Eagle would eventually come to an end. And that end came in April of 1998, as it was on the Raw after WrestleMania 14, where he'd won the gold from Shawn Michaels, that Stone Cold Steve Austin would be presented with an all-new belt, one we'll get to in a moment. But even if it was gone now, fan nostalgia for this classic design would remain over the years, with many calling for it to return as the decades went on. And in the end, these fans would get their wish, because at the recent Saturday Night's Main Event revival in December of 2024, WWE would bring the Winged Eagle back for one night only when Cody Rhodes wore it down to the ring, with this being a hugely well-received move by everyone who was watching the show, as it perfectly fit in with the nostalgia-infused tone of the evening. But what of the other belt Steve Austin was awarded in lieu of the Winged Eagle back in 1998? Was that a good design in its own right? Why, yes, it was, and that's exactly why the Big Eagle is our next entry. That's right, the Big Eagle, as fans would come to call it on account of it looking like the Winged Eagle but a bit chunkier and fuller, is also a very well-remembered version of the WWF title in its own right. And the reason for this isn't just because it also looked great, like something a champion would be proud to be seen carrying through the airport with them, but because as well as that, it was around at the peak of the industry. Sure, some will argue that the peak of Hulk Hogan's golden era was a bigger moment culturally, but if you look at the number in terms of TV ratings and merch sales, nothing tops the Attitude Era of the turn of the millennium. And it was during the Attitude Era that the Big Eagle reigned supreme. So because of that then, not only would it spend a significant period of time being carried down to the ring by Stone Cold, probably the most over wrestler the industry had ever seen by this point, but it would also be carried by a who's who of legends of the time, names like Triple H, Mick Foley, The Undertaker, Kurt Angle, Kane, and of course, The Rock. And with this being the time that pretty much every kid on the planet was watching wrestling again, it meant they all knew exactly who was in possession of it at any given time. Seriously, while it might not look quite as good as the Winged Eagle in some fans' eyes, you could argue that the Big Eagle is even more iconic, purely because of the time period it was around, because everything about the Attitude Era is iconic today. So when you have a belt as good as the Big Eagle, there's no way it wasn't going to get over in the audience's eyes. Like with the Winged Eagle before it though, the time would eventually come for this one to be retired too, and that time would be after it was merged with the WCW World title in late 2001 to create an all-new Undisputed title. Sure, this new belt wouldn't be introduced right away. No, for at least the first few months, Chris Jericho would carry around two belts with him. But once it was decided a new design was needed to represent this new piece of hardware, that would be brought in. Luckily for us though, that particular belt would also look great, enough to where it's our next entry. Yes, the Undisputed title also has a very vocal fan base of people who loved its design, and that's quite simply because it looked great, like a sleeker and more modernized version of what came before, with it still including that iconic eagle on the front faceplate, but now in a less emphasized way, perhaps to show that this was now a merging of both the WWF and WCW belts. So when it was awarded to Triple H in April of 2002 after he won the gold from Chris Jericho, any disappointment fans had over seeing the Big Eagle disappear quickly evaporated as they realized that what they had now was arguably even better. Hell, this was something that looked so good, many wished it could have been the top prize of the Attitude Era. But instead of being around for that period, the Undisputed title would be around for the early years of the Ruthless Aggression Era instead. And that meant it would be right there in front and center, being fought over by the likes of Brock Lesnar, Kurt Angle, and The Undertaker. In fact, so popular would this belt design be, even when it was no longer the Undisputed title on account of it becoming SmackDown exclusive and Raw getting the World Heavyweight title instead, the same look would remain, with it now being simply referred to as the WWE title again. And during that reign, it would have an arguably even greater lineage of holders, with this being the time that it was also held by the likes of JBL and Eddie Guerrero. Yes, cast your mind back to that moment where Latino Heat famously overcame the odds by beating Brock Lesnar at No Way Out 2004, and you'll remember that it was this belt that he held above his head as he jumped into the crowd to be with his people after the match was over. And this isn't the only iconic moment associated with the Undisputed title design. No, there's also that great Iron Man match between the Beast and Kurt Angle on an episode of SmackDown where they fought over possession of it, or the time that it was briefly held by legends from prior eras like The Rock and Hulk Hogan. All of this is to say then, there are plenty of reasons to remember this particular title with fondness. Does this mean we'll ever see it revived, especially in light of the Winged Eagle returning? We suppose it's possible. But before that happens, we expect it's more likely we'll see the return of another belt design instead, One which to many older fans of territorial wrestling represents the greatest design ever, the one, the only, Big Gold Belt. Ah yes, the Big Gold Belt. The title that represented the #1 prize in all of wrestling for a while, as back during the 80s, it was what the National Wrestling Alliance used for their world title. And that meant it would be held by some of the greatest legends to ever lace up a pair of boots, names like Sting, Ric Flair, and many more. Hell, so great would it look with its gigantic gold faceplate announcing from miles away that the champion of the world was coming once WCW was formed out of the ashes of Jim Crockett Promotions during the late 80s, and that company effectively became the new home base of the NWA. The Big Gold Belt would transfer over there instead. Obviously then, this meant a whole host of other great names would get to hold it down in Atlanta, people like Vader. That said, for the most part, it always remained around the waist of the Nature Boy. And because of this, when he left WCW in 1991 while still in possession of it, he'd actually be able to take it over to WWF with him for a brief time, where he paraded it around, all while proclaiming himself to be the real world's champion. As you would expect, however, this did not go down well with WCW management. And so it was that before long, the Big Gold Belt would be back in their possession, and this meant it was still there when that company had their own boom period during the mid to late 90s after the New World Order was formed and Hollywood Hogan came to be its newest holder. But being a part of the rebel group coming in to destroy the company, Hogan had no intention of respecting the history of this particular prize, which was exactly why, after winning it, he'd desecrate it by spray painting a big NWO logo over that famous front faceplate. How would WCW respond to such an outrage? Well, they'd do everything they could to have one of their own win it back, something which eventually happened when Sting toppled the Hulkster at Starrcade 1997. And after that, the Big Gold Belt would be returned to its former glory as it hung around for the rest of WCW's existence, right through to the Invasion, where it was eventually unified with the WWF title. Even then, though, that would not be the end of this title, as when Raw needed a new top prize in 2002, the Big Gold Belt would be brought back again, this time as the World Heavyweight title. And that's the position it would remain in all the way up until it was deactivated once more in 2014, with this period allowing it to be held by a whole host of new legends like John Cena, CM Punk, Batista, and Daniel Bryan, just to name a few. Of course, even before the Big Gold Belt was first introduced as the NWA title way back in 1986, though, it wasn't like the NWA didn't have an equally as great design for their top prize. They were the #1 body in wrestling back then, after all. No, back during the 70s and early 80s, they had a design which was equally as cherished by many today, the 10 pounds of gold. That's right, back during the earliest reigns of Ric Flair on top, this was the belt he held. And what a belt it was. In fitting with the name, it looked amazing with its 10 pounds of gold spread out across its various plates which not only let anyone who was looking know that this was the World Heavyweight Championship of the National Wrestling Alliance, but also all the different countries with proud wrestling traditions it represented, places like the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Mexico. Needless to say then, this was the one that every wrestler wanted to win back during the 70s, as to hold it meant you weren't just the champion of a particular territory. No, it meant you were the top guy in the entire industry. Someone who the governing body of wrestling could trust to represent them with all the class and dignity you'd expect a champion to have. And that's exactly why it should come as no surprise that the people who held the 10 pounds of gold around their waist represent a who's who of the best the time period had to offer. Seriously, we're not just talking about names like Ric Flair here. No, we're also talking about first ballot Hall of Famers such as Harley Race, Jack Briscoe, Terry Funk, and Dusty Rhodes. Of course, as time went on though, and the Big Gold Belt was introduced to much fanfare, it felt very much like this was a design which was going to be relegated to history. That was until it was brought back again in 1993 under controversial circumstances when new champion Shane Douglas threw it down on the ground after winning it, in the process proclaiming himself to be the Extreme Championship Wrestling World Champion instead. Was this a blow to the credibility of the 10 pounds of gold? Sure, but it wouldn't be enough to damage it too much in the long term, as after that it would continue to be the belt used by the NWA as their top prize. Yes, it's true that these were dark times for the brand, and that few really considered it a world title anymore by then, but it would get an unexpected revival in fortunes during the late 2010s, as that was when Billy Corgan bought the National Wrestling Alliance and brought it over to YouTube full time. That said, not every great belt design has to come from a world title. No, some can come from mid-card straps instead. And one of those is our next subject as it happens, the classic 80s and 90s design of the WWF Intercontinental title. You know the design we're talking about here. It's the one that was used in WWF during the Golden Era, back when it was truly the workhorse championship that any real wrestler wanted to hold above all else. And that was exactly why this was the era where it got put around the waists of show-stealing performers like Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Mr. Perfect, and of course, Macho Man Randy Savage. In fact, so in demand would the classic Intercontinental title be, at one point the Ultimate Warrior managed to come in possession of it while he was in the middle of his meteoric rise. And being the Warrior, he'd be allowed to customize it to give it that famous white strap that so many remember fondly today. For the most part though, it would be the black strap that this incarnation of the mid-card prize had, and it's this version which would mostly later be held by even more legends like Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, Steve Austin, The Rock, and Triple H. Unfortunately for fans of this design though, by the time the Attitude Era was in full swing, a new version of the belt would be introduced, with this one not having the same sense of magic for many who grew up watching it be the real standout one WWF had in its arsenal. Should it come as a surprise to learn that for years afterwards, fans would demand a return to that classic design? And they weren't the only ones demanding this either, as it happened. No, Cody Rhodes was also a big proponent of reviving that old look when he won the belt in 2011. And in the end, that's exactly what he did, with him not only bringing back the classic version here, but also the version with the white strap to boot. Sure, after this, it would disappear once more, as during the 2000s and 2010s, little to no attention was often given to the Intercontinental title. But thankfully, that would finally change again once Gunther won it in 2022. Does this mean we can hope to see such a design revived once more under this new WWE regime? Given the fact that they just brought back the Winged Eagle, anything is possible. Hell, who knows? Before all is said and done, we might even see the revival of another set of classic Golden Era and early Attitude Era belts. The one which, as fans of the time will fondly remember, once represented the WWF Tag Team titles. Now, the Tag Team titles have had an up and down history when it comes to designs. After all, many fans dislike the infamous penny belts. But this wasn't always the case for that set of straps, because back in the 80s and 90s, the design they had was held in much better regard. Why was that? Well, they looked just beautiful. Yes, these belts were simple yet elegant, with a front plate which bore the image of that old eagle along with some text to confirm these were for the tag team champions of the world. And the teams who wore these belts over the years certainly looked good with them. Just go back and watch some old footage of the British Bulldogs, the Hart Foundation, or Demolition. And then go on towards the Attitude Era and see how well they sat around the waists of duos like the New Age Outlaws, the Acolytes, and the Hardy Boys. Yes, there's a reason this design hung around for as long as it did, and that reason is there was a certain timeless quality to the tag team titles in the WWF back then. A timeless quality that would somewhat be lost as the years went on and different designs were introduced in their place. Honestly, you can make an argument for these belts being the best designed tag team ones of all time. Sadly though, as the Attitude Era progressed and it was felt like WWF had to continue progressing with the times by shedding any of that old nostalgia of the past, these particular belts would be sent off to pasture, along with other belts we've already mentioned like the Winged Eagle or the classic Intercontinental title design. Is it finally time for these classic tag title belts to make a return in the future too? After all, there are plenty of duos in current day WWE who we can imagine would love a chance to wear them. We suppose the answer to that question is we'll have to wait and find out, but it wouldn't be unheard of for the WWE to do this. And no, we're not just talking about the Winged Eagle here, rather we're talking about a classic title from the 80s which has periodically reappeared in the decades since. Our next entry as it happens. Which belt design are we talking about? Why, the $1 million title, of course. Hell, it's one of the most eye-catching designs any wrestling belt has ever had. No, it may not be to everyone's tastes, but for those who love it, it's a true one-of-a-kind, as it forgoes any of the usual things that make up a classic title belt, such as traditional faceplate or any text telling us what it represents. Rather, it's just a gold strap with several diamond-encrusted dollar signs spread across it, with 3 particularly big ones set right there in the middle. Needless to say then, this one was the personal title for the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, with him first introducing it back in 1989 after several failed attempts to get the world title off Hulk Hogan led the heel to just simply commission his own prize. Sure, it was never a belt that was officially sanctioned by WWF or anything, but that didn't matter too much to DiBiase. No, all he was concerned about was how good it looked around his waist, and this was why he would usually be seen wearing it whenever he came down to the ring thereafter. That said, the $1 Million title wasn't always in Ted's possession. No, on occasion it would move over to someone else, either as a result of him losing it to them in a match, as happened when Virgil memorably won it in 1991, or it being passed on to someone else, as happened with Ted DiBiase Jr. in 2010. But whenever this happened, the belt continued to look good regardless of whose waist it was around, as it was still that diamond-encrusted gold prize that perfectly summed up the excess of the era in which it was first introduced. In fact, so long-lasting would this one be, it's even returned to WWE TV as recently as 2021. Yes, this was the point that it became a MacGuffin to be fought over by LA Knight and Cameron Grimes down in NXT. Ultimately though, despite winning this feud and becoming the new $1 Million champion as a result, it would not be Grimes who was in possession of the belt itself once all was said and done. No, the last time we saw it, it was back within the grasp of its original owner again, with this leading us to assume that as things stand today, it remains on Ted DiBiase's shelf, the very place it will likely remain until the time comes for it to be brought back to TV once more. But what about the UK branch of NXT? After all, they had their own belts too. Yes, it's time to talk about the NXT UK titles. Why are we including all of the NXT UK titles in this entry? Well, because they all looked equally as great as each other, and so it doesn't seem fair to pick one over another when deciding on what to include in this video. Now, whether we're talking about the NXT United Kingdom Championship, the NXT UK Women's Championship, or the NXT UK Tag Team Championships, each one looked fantastic, and they all looked pretty similar too, particularly the Men's and Women's World Championships, as they had pretty much the same faceplate, a gold British-themed design with a splash of red to highlight the NXT UK logo, with the only real difference being that one had a black strap and the other had a white one. Then there's the NXT UK Tag Team titles. While they were a little different in that their faceplates were a little more circular, the rest of the design was similar enough. Of course, it always helps a belt to look good if there are some great wrestlers holding it, and luckily for the NXT UK titles, there was no shortage of great wrestlers who won them during their all-too-brief history. Seriously, if we're talking about the men's world title, then the people who wore that include the likes of Pete Dunne, Ilya Dragunov, and of course, Walter. And if we're talking about the women's world title, well, that was held by not only Kaylee Ray and Miko Satomura, but also arguably the two biggest stars in all of women's wrestling today, Rhea Ripley and Toni Storm. Sure, the NXT UK Tag Team titles might not have quite as impressive of a lineage as that, but they still had an impressive one. After all, when we're talking about belts that were held by the grizzled young veterans, Mustache Mountain, and Pretty Deadly, how could they not? That's right. While they might not have lasted for long, the NXT UK titles certainly made the mark for fans who were watching the show week in and week out, and a big part of the reason they were held in such high regard by those fans was because they looked great around the waist of anyone who was in possession of them at any given moment. But let's move away from WWE and its various brands for a moment again, and back over to the world of WCW instead, as this is where we find our next great belt design. Which one of the many titles that company has had over the years are we talking about here? The 90s version of the United States title, of course. That's right. While there have been many different versions of the United States title which have existed across the years between Jim Crockett Promotions, World Championship Wrestling, and WWE, too many to count in fact, the design most beloved by fans has been the 90s version, and this was the one which was introduced in 1991 after Ivan Koloff destroyed the prior version. And this design does everything it needs to do and more, what with it having a nice gold faceplate adorned with an American flag and some equally as nice side plates showing off some of the grappling that would make the title so well regarded. Unsurprisingly then, given how good it looked, this one would remain in circulation all the way up until WCW went out of business in 2001, and that means it was there through multiple eras of the promotion, including their big mid to late 90s boom period. Who would be some of the people who held it during this time? Well, like with some other belts we've looked at today, it's pretty much a who's who of some of the biggest names of the era. We're talking about people like Sting, Vader, Ric Flair, Diamond Dallas Page, Goldberg, and of course, a young Steve Austin. Yes, before he was the rattlesnake over in WWF, Stone Cold was first cutting his teeth in WCW with this piece of hardware. But then that's what a great mid-card title should do. Help to elevate someone to that next level on their route towards the top. And it always helps these performers get over if the belt looks as good as the 90s version of the United States one did. Which is why it's such a shame that when Vince McMahon bought the company out at the dawn of the new millennium, this design would not last much longer. No, once the US title eventually made its full-time return again in 2003, it would be an all-new design that was featured, one which, while it certainly had some charm of its own, wasn't quite as beloved by fans as the prior version had been. But then maybe the fact it eventually went away is part of the reason it's so well remembered today, as absence certainly makes the heart grow fonder. That said, if it were up to us, Not only would this one make a full-time return in the present day, but all the belts we've looked at today would, because they each represent some of the greatest designs the industry has ever seen, with all of them proving that a good-looking belt really can make all the difference in the world. Often in wrestling, when someone wins a title, it's expected. Hell, often it's the climax of a long-running story. Just look at Steve Austin in 1998 or Cody Rhodes in 2024. Other times, though, a title change seems to come out of nowhere and surprise us all. But what are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with one of the more recent examples, Ethan Page becoming NXT World Champion. Yes, prior to 2024, it would have been hard to think of Ethan Page as being a world champion in WWE, as while he was always a great wrestler, he was never a star on the level of some of the other names who have held such belts. No, he was more known for being a good hand who could always deliver in the ring when asked to in other places, such as TNA, Ring of Honor, and AEW. So how did he manage to ascend so quickly once he joined the NXT roster in May of 2024 here? Well, after signing with WWE and reporting straight to NXT, it seems that the behind-the-scenes booking team took a liking to Page and gave him a lot of opportunities to shine. And boy, would he make the most of these opportunities, as it wasn't long before he'd be calling himself champion. And this victory would come at 2024's Heatwave event, as Page would win a fatal four-way match to win the title. And after this, he'd go on to hold the belt for the next few months, defending it in some great bouts. Yes, this run was a real career high, and something the Ontario native was deserving of, but was certainly a random win that few saw coming. Of course, Ethan Page isn't the only former TNA alumni who recently walked into WWE for the first time and found themselves winning a title instantly, though. No, mere months later, the exact same situation would play itself out with our next subjects, the Motor City Machine Guns, when they became WWE Tag Team Champions. Yes, it's long been known that the Motor City Machine Guns are one of the best tag teams in the world, and that throughout their career, their style has proved to be so influential, many of the duos you see working to a high level today likely wouldn't exist without them. But up until 2024, they never managed to get that run on a big stage, and this was always the one mark against them. Not that this seemed to be an issue to Chris Sabin and Alex Shelley, though. No, they seemed more than happy to dominate places like TNA and Ring of Honor, becoming tag team champions multiple times over in the process. But in the last year or so, something obviously changed. And so that was why, when their most recent TNA contracts ran out in the summer of 2024, they decided to test the free agency market. And this eventually led to the Guns signing on the dotted line with WWE, and from there immediately being sent over to the SmackDown roster. Still though, even if such a legendary team were now on Friday nights, it didn't mean they were going to succeed in terms of title success. No, with them now being in the twilight run of their careers, many assumed they'd just been brought in to put on good matches and get other younger duos over. But this was not the way things played out in the end, because it was after only a few weeks as part of WWE when Sabin and Shelley found themselves challenging DIY for that brand's tag team titles and going all the way by winning them. That's right, in a scene which would have made fans of mid to late 2000s Impact very happy, the Motor City Machine Guns were now standing on top of the mountain in WWE, with this finally allowing them to cross that last item from their bucket list as they fully solidified themselves as an all-time legendary pairing. That said, while MCMG might be better known for their tag team antics, this isn't to say the two haven't ventured out into singles action as well, mostly during their time working in the Impact Zone. Hell, at one point, this even led to another random title change when Chris Sabin became the TNA World Champion for a while. That's right, back in 2013, fans would be treated as something special, as it was while undergoing a rare singles run in the X Division that Chris Sabin found himself earning a shot at the top prize in Nashville, the one then being held by Bully Ray. Of course, by this point, Bully Ray, himself too once a tag team guy, had firmly established himself as a single star. And so, when one half of the Motor City Machine Guns challenged him for his gold, it was expected it would be a really easy night for the former Dudley Boy. Not because Sabin wasn't great, but because he just didn't have that same level of experience as a solo act. In the end, though, that's what made it all the more surprising when, at the conclusion of their big bout at July 18th's Destination X that year, it would be Sabin who was standing tall with the gold around his waist. What would he do from here? Well, he wouldn't hold the title for very long, with him losing it back to Bully Ray in his first defense. His performance in both bouts went a long way towards showing he was far more than a fluke champion. No, this was definitely a case of quality over quantity when it came to his run as champ. Sure, the short length of it has made it even easier to forget about in the years since, and it has also made it all the more random in hindsight, but random as it may have been, the sight of Chris Sabin as a singles world champion is still one we're glad exists, as it shows just how great wrestling can be at times. And once it was over, the 7-time tag team champion would keep the momentum going by returning to partnering with Alex Shelley as they further solidified their status as legends of tag team wrestling, a pair who can stand right up there with other modern days greats of the division like the Usos and the New Day. And that's a status they hold right up until the present day. Still though, we'll never forget that brief moment where Chris Sabin reached the mountaintop in the singles division as well, as it's just such a great addition to his overall career. But then it's not like TNA hasn't had random world champions since this moment, and no, we're not talking about the time Alex Shelley spent as champ here. Rather, we're talking about the time a woman broke the mold by holding a semi-major men's world title for the first time ever when Tessa Blanchard won the big one in Impact. That's right, let's flash back to 2019 for a moment, a time when the wrestling landscape was a very different place. Vince McMahon was still in charge of WWE, AEW was only just getting started, and over in TNA, they were about to make history. What history was this? Well, they were about to take their men's world title and give it to a woman. And the reason TNA decided to do this was because Tessa Blanchard was an absolute phenomenon in the ring. But then given the fact this was the daughter of legendary Four Horsemen member Tully Blanchard, maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise. No, we all should have seen it coming in hindsight, especially as the summer of that year dawned and the momentum the Charlotte native had been building up really hit that next level. And Tessa would ultimately have her big moment at the Hard to Kill pay-per-view on January 12th, 2020, as it was here that, in what was supposed to be a defining moment for both her and for the company, Tessa would beat Sami Callihan in the main event to take home the gold for her own. Yes, it was history being made in front of our eyes, and yet another sign of a woman breaking through the glass ceiling. So that's why it's such a shame it all had to be so short-lived then. And the reason it was so short-lived was because on the day of the big win, Tessa got into some major trouble behind the scenes, with this effectively nuking any goodwill many of the fan base had for her. And this left TNA forced to act. And the way they acted was to keep Tessa off of TV for the immediate future as they figured out what to do next when it came to her reign on top. How would things go following this? Well, with it being the point the world went into shutdown, the decision would effectively be made for Impact when, after the new champion was unable to make a series of dates, they'd be forced to strip her of the gold anyway, meaning she'd only get to make one successful defense before it was all over against Taya Valkyrie. Is Tessa Blanchard's reign more random than our next entry, however? The time Cody Rhodes and Jey Uso became undisputed WWE Tag Team Champions together in WWE. How the heck did this one happen? After all, Cody Rhodes and Jey Uso have never been regular tag team partners. In fact, for most of his career, Jey has been in a duo with his twin brother Jimmy, and during the rare times the American Nightmare has entered the tag division, it's usually been with people like Ted DiBiase Jr. or his own brother, Goldust. But then 2023 happened, and during that year-long stretch between him losing to Roman Reigns at WrestleMania 39 and finally overcoming the Tribal Chief at WrestleMania 40, the grandson of a plumber found himself needing something to do to keep himself busy. Enter Jey Uso, someone who, while he had been a heel as part of the Bloodline for 3 years prior to that, had now just turned babyface after leaving the family behind and jumping over to Raw. Understandably though, given his past antics, he didn't find many friends in the babyface locker room once he did show up on Monday nights. One person who did have his back, however, was Cody Rhodes. Why was this? Well, we suppose Cody truly believed that Jey had changed, and that was what led to the two of them deciding to team up at this point and go after some tag team gold together. Sure, given their collective star power, it might seem obvious in hindsight they were going to beat the Judgment Day when they challenged Finn Balor and Damian Priest for the unified Raw and SmackDown belts at October 7th's Fastlane that year. But considering they had no history of teaming together, and so had not worked out an obvious chemistry with one another, many fans at the time assumed it would just be another successful defense for the Judgment Day. And that's what made it such a surprise then, and so random feeling when the bout came to an end with the babyface duo on top. Where would Cody and Jey go now that they were tag team champions and, as a result, had a passport to visit either of WWE's main roster shows anytime they wanted? Well, they'd make use of this by appearing on both SmackDown and Raw over the following weeks, defending their titles against all comers, all until the point they eventually lost them back to the Judgment Day on October 16th. But this wouldn't be the only time an odd couple duo had a seemingly random run as tag team champions in WWE. No, years prior to this, back in 2004, way before either Cody Rhodes or Jey Uso ever made their debuts, a similar story would be playing itself out with our next subjects, Charlie Haas and Rico. Now, if you know Charlie Haas, then you likely know him for one thing: being a great tag team wrestler. That said, throughout his career, the most successful period he ever had as part of a tag team was clearly his time spent with Shelton Benjamin. Hell, while a duo, those two were able to win gold on a total of 4 separate occasions across both WWE and Ring of Honor. But this wasn't the only time Haas would be able to call himself a champion in the tag team division. No, it was back in 2004 that after his Fed run with Shelton Benjamin came to an end, the Oklahoma native found himself looking for a new partner. And the partner he'd find here would be a surprising one, to say the least. Why was this? Well, because it was Rico Constantino, the man who up until then had been known primarily for being the personal stylist to Billy and Chuck. As you'd expect then, the idea that Charlie Haas and Rico would have in-ring chemistry seemed unlikely to fans watching at the time. But much to everyone's surprise, this is exactly what the pair proved to have. So much chemistry would they share, in fact, on the April 20th episode of SmackDown that year, they defeat the Too Cool pairing of Rikishi and Scotty 2 Hotty to become WWE Tag Team Champions. No, it wouldn't be a long reign. In fact, it would come to an end only a couple of months later when the Dudley Boys beat them for the belts. But like with Cody Rhodes and Jey Uso or Chris Sabin, that only makes this one all the more random and all the more worthy of inclusion in today's video. Really though, more than anything else, what this reign represents is a snapshot of where the WWE Tag Team division was by the time the mid-2000s came around. A weird place where random odd couple duos were thrown together on a seemingly haphazard basis, kept together for a few months, and then moved over into a feud with one another. But what about WCW? Didn't they have their own random title changes too? Specifically in the tag team division? Why, yes they did. And one of those teams is our next subject as it happens, the one made up of Rick Steiner and Judy Bagwell. Who was Judy Bagwell? Well, she was the real-life mother of Buff Bagwell, then star of World Championship Wrestling. Obviously, though, she wasn't a wrestler, so her path toward winning a title was never going to be a normal one. No, that all came about after a very strange and, some would say, random set of circumstances. Yes, it was in November of 1998 that after ditching his prior tag team partner Kenny Chaos, Rick Steiner was forced to find a new one. And he was forced to do this fast as at that point in time, he was one half of the WCW Tag Team Champions, a set of belts he couldn't defend alone. But while it might have been obvious for him to choose a big name here like Bill Goldberg, Sting, or even Hulk Hogan, in the end the Michigan native chose to go with someone who wasn't even an in-ring performer. Why was this? Well, it was all a ploy to get in the head of one of his opponents that night, namely Buff Bagwell. That's right, on the November 9th episode of Nitro from that year, Rick was due to defend his gold against both his brother Scott and Buff. So looking to enact a bit of psychological warfare and throw the opposing team off of their game then, he revealed his new partner that night to be none other than Judy Bagwell. Of course, given the fact that Rick won the match that night pretty much single-handedly, this would mean going forward, Judy Bagwell was now going to be a WCW Tag Team Champion too. And before you ask, yes, we've checked, and this definitely didn't happen in 2000. WCW was actually going off the rails long before that. How would Judy fare now that she had gold around her waist? Would she and Rick Steiner go on a tear through the entire tag team division? Not exactly. Because during the rematch between the four at World War III a few weeks later, Buff's mother would get injured, and this would mean her mighty reign with the gold would ultimately have to come to an untimely end. Sure, it might have only been short-lived, but the fact it happened at all is reason enough for people to wonder what the hell WCW were thinking by making such a move back during a period that they were arguably still supposed to be riding high. Was it just sheer hubris? Or did they honestly think it was a great idea? Either way, it's certainly one of the most random tag team title runs the wrestling world has ever seen. But it's not the only time a non-wrestler has found themselves holding tag gold over the years. No, back in WWE towards the end of the 2010s, the same thing would occur when Braun Strowman and Nicholas became Raw Tag Team Champions. How did it all happen? Well, in the weeks leading up to WrestleMania 34, Braun Strowman had made his intentions clear in that he wanted to take the Raw Tag Team titles away from The Bar. Of course, in fitting with his character though, he felt he didn't need a partner to do this. No, he wanted to do it alone. One person who didn't agree with an assessment, however, was then Raw General Manager Kurt Angle. He instead demanded that the Monster Among Men find a second if he was going to challenge Sheamus and Cesaro. And that led to the night of WrestleMania coming, and the big man choosing to just select a random person from the audience. and Braun would go on to pick a 10-year-old boy named Nicholas. No, you didn't hear us wrong. What followed was a preteen pairing up with Strowman to not only challenge the Bar, but beat them. And this meant that by the time all was said and done, Nicholas would be a Raw Tag Team Champion, and as a result, the youngest champion in WWE history by a considerable distance. Needless to say, though, Nicholas, who was in truth the son of referee John Cone, would not be able to defend his title going forward. No, he had too much schoolwork getting in the way of that. So it was then that the following night on Raw, he'd make an appearance to announce his vacancy of the gold, and because he never lost the belt in a match, that means he's still technically undefeated, and at WrestleMania no less. Will this be the start of an Undertaker-esque win streak for him at the Showcase of the Immortals? Who knows? Anything's possible. Hell, maybe the main event of WrestleMania 50 will be him taking on Brody Lee's son, -1. One thing's for sure though, until that happens, he'll be primarily remembered for his time being a tag team champion with Braun Strowman, with this being only the second most unlikely tag team champions we can think of, the first being Bret Hart and Bill Goldberg in WCW. Yes, it's wild that the Hitman and Goldberg were tag team champions together back in December of 1999, if for no other reason than because we all know the history between them. Hell, it's become a bit of a meme at this point that Bret isn't a fan of Bill's to say the least, perhaps even more so than he ever disliked a Shawn Michaels or a Vince McMahon. That's right, seeing Bret Hart and Goldberg on the same page, that's just weird with the benefit of hindsight. That said, back in 1999, no ill feelings had developed between them yet. And so it was fairly normal that they'd choose to team up together as they were both baby faces, and mega ones at that. So when it came time for someone to take the WCW tag team titles away from Creative Control, aka the Harris brothers, they seemed like an obvious fit for a supergroup able to get the job done. And that's exactly what they do, because despite not being a regular duo, it was on the December 7th episode of Thunder that year that they were able to dethrone the heels and, in the process, become the new champions themselves. A little bit random at the time? Sure. Very random in hindsight? Yeah, absolutely. But then, by this point, there were a lot of random things happening in WCW on a regular basis. And as if there needed to be any further randomness added to this reign, it would only last for 6 days before it came to an end, not even a full week. That's right, as was the tradition with wrestling at the turn of the millennium, belts changed hands on a dime. And so it was that when the new babyface megapowers of Bret Hart and Bill Goldberg engaged in their first defense against the Outsiders on the December 13th episode of Nitro, they lose. What happened to their team after that? Well, it wouldn't last. No, each man would go back over to their own thing for, well, a week. Yeah, it was only 6 days later at Starrcade that the two would find themselves in the ring again, this time on opposite ends. And this was the fateful evening that Bret took an errant mule kick from Bill and ended up suffering a concussion which would be so bad it would cause him to retire mere months later. And this has been the cause of the heat between the duo in the years since. But let's move away from that and back over to WWE instead, as it's there we find our next random title win, one which happened in 2004 when Carlito became United States Champion. And the reason his first run with the US Gold felt so out of the blue was because it happened during his first night on the SmackDown roster. Yes, it was on October 7th of that year that he showed up to challenge then United States Champion John Cena, and with a little help from a steel chain he used behind the referee's back, even be able to beat him. Sure, this isn't the only time a wrestling company has done the gimmick of someone coming in on night one and winning a title, but usually the person on the losing end isn't someone who's being prepared to be the next face of the company. In this case, however, that was exactly what happened, as it was Big Match John who ate the fall. And for that reason alone, it was hugely shocking to see a rookie come in and get the better of him right away. How would Carlito fare after this big victory? Well, using all the momentum it afforded him, he'd go on a 14-match undefeated streak, fully establishing himself as a player in the process. And it wasn't just nobodies he was beating here either. No, it would be names like Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and Rob Van Dam who fell to the power of being cool like he was. Sure, he would end up losing eventually. That was always going to be inevitable. Nobody's win streak lasts forever. But during that period, he was able to show that he truly belonged in the spot he was in, and the only reason he was able to prove this was because he called his shot so spectacularly on night one by beating John Cena. Clearly then, this is an example of a random title change that did only good things for everyone involved, even Cena, as it allowed him to eventually start transitioning over to the world title scene. And it's one which the effects of are still being felt today, as even now in 2025, Carlito remains a part of the Raw roster as a member of the Judgment Day 2.0, alongside Finn Balor, JD McDonough, Liv Morgan, Dominic Mysterio, and Raquel Rodriguez. But then all of the examples we've looked at today were good in their own ways, even if what was good about them was simply having a camp value. And that's why they each deserve their own spot in this video as some of the most random title changes wrestling has ever given us. While there are some titles which feel like they'll be around forever at this point, if you look back at wrestling history, the reality is that most belts have an end date. Of course, when this happens, someone gets to have the honor of being the final holder of that title, with this happening to some of the most prestigious titles of all time. But who are the most notable examples of final champions in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the final WCW World Heavyweight Champion, Booker T. Yes, well, technically here, the last ever WCW champion may be classed as Chris Jericho, as he was the one who beat Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock back-to-back in the same night in order to unify it with the WWF title at December 9th, 2001's Vengeance pay-per-view. For the purposes of today's video, we'll be looking at the original WCW version of the title, the one that ended when its parent company did, and that version was held by none other than Booker T. How did Booker T come to be champion as WCW was closing its doors? Well, it was a last-minute thing as it happened, because despite being hot-shotted around a staggering 25 times in 2000, for the last few months of the promotion's existence, it did start to gain some sense of stability again. And the way it gained such stability was by Scott Steiner winning at November 26th's Mayhem pay-per-view and holding it for the next 4 months, all the way up until the final Nitro on March 26, 2001 in fact. So you'd think that given how much he'd done to help rescue the belt, Big Papa Pump would get to go down with the ship as the final champion then. But that wasn't the case, because after Vince McMahon purchased the company at this point, he evidently saw more in Booker T as a top guy. And so that was why Booker would defeat Steiner on the last episode of Nitro to become champ. Obviously then, because of outside circumstances, Booker never got to do much of anything during this run. Hell, even when he officially joined WWF in the summer of that year, he'd have dropped the gold to Kurt Angle come the July 26th episode of SmackDown. But even if it was an uneventful run overall, it still marks an important moment in history, because it would be the last time a new WCW World Champion was crowned while that company was still alive in its original incarnation. But what of the other big company of the Monday Night Wars, the one which also died in early 2001? Well, when it comes to ECW, their final World Heavyweight Champion is a lot clearer, as WWF didn't bring their belt over to WWF once they bought them too. No, the last person to hold that was none other than Rhino. And yes, while it's easy to associate him with the glory days of Paul Heyman's Renegade promotion, Rhino's time in Extreme Championship Wrestling actually came during their later years, with him being one of the few wrestlers that helped to keep things afloat in Philadelphia for as long as possible. Of course, his value was never more evident than in 2001, as this was the point where, desperately trying to shake things up and capture fans' attention again, Heyman decided to put the title on Rhino, as he was someone who felt fresh and new as a top guy. And the way Heyman made this change was somewhat unique too, as the big win actually marked the second time the ECW World Heavyweight title changed hands on that night. That's right, at January 7th, 2001's Guilty as Charged pay-per-view, after the Sandman defeated Just Incredible and incoming champion Steve Corino in a tables, ladders, and canes match, Rhino came out to challenge the fan favorite, and after this challenge was accepted, he beat him in just 1 minute to become the new top dog in the promotion. Does this make the beginning of the last ECW champion's reign somewhat anticlimactic? Sure. But at least the Detroit native got to hold on to it for a few months after that before Paul Heyman officially closed the doors of Extreme in April. And it does at least mean the last champion in the brand during its original incarnation was someone who was able to embody the spirit of what it had been at its best. But what about the other version of the belt, the WWECW World title? Well, its final champion was none other than Ezekiel Jackson. That's right, the man most well known for being a former member of the Core and fixture on WWECW during the late 2000s, and as it happens, when that brand closed its doors in February of 2010, he'd be the last person to hold their world title. How did he come to be holding this title? Well, like with Booker T's WCW World Heavyweight title win, it would come on the last night of the show's existence. Yes, it was during the final episode of ECW TV on the 16th of that month that Jackson got the better of incoming champ Christian, and as a result walked out of their match the new holder of the top prize. Not that he'd get anything to do with it afterwards though, as, like we said a moment ago, this was literally the last night of the brand's existence, and so it would be immediately deactivated afterwards. But what about our next subject, Nikki Cross? As back in 2022, she was the one who formally deactivated the 24/7 title, and as such, became the last person to ever hold it. Yes, the 24/7 title was a belt that never quite caught on with many fans, as it was often compared to the nostalgia of the hardcore title. And as well as this, most weeks on Raw we would see the same story play out, with a group of superstars chasing R-Truth around backstage, someone eventually pinning him, and then Truth immediately pinning them to get his baby back. That's right, while the 24/7 title did have a lot of potential and gave us some funny moments during Truth's reigns, the title never quite felt as special as it could have. That said, when it comes to the last night of its existence, the November 7th, 2022 episode of Raw, R-Truth was actually nowhere to be seen, as at this point, the champion was Scotland's own Nikki ASH. And as it happened, she'd actually held the belt for a total of 11 days by that point, an eternity in 24/7 title terms. But evidently deciding she didn't want anything more to do with it then, especially as she was now already in the process of fully transforming back into her old Nikki Cross character. While walking backstage, the Scotswoman would casually throw the belt in the trash, with this being the last time it was ever seen on screen. And with Vince McMahon now gone from WWE, the chances of us ever seeing this particular belt again are slim to none, and Nikki Cross will forever go down as the final champion in the belt's lineage. But what about our next subject, Bron Breakker, one of the top up-and-coming superstars on Monday Night Raw? Well, his greatness has been evident since his days in NXT, as this is where he'd go on to become the face of the brand for a couple of years, where he achieved numerous accolades, including the time he became the last person to ever hold the NXT United Kingdom Championship. But wait, how could Bron Breakker have been the last NXT UK champion when he never actually wrestled on this brand? After all, we're talking about a title that was for the most part defended in an entirely separate continent to where he lives, with it usually being contested over by the likes of Pete Dunne, Tyler Bate, Ilya Dragunov, and our Lord and Savior Gunther. Well, the way this one came about was a result of NXT UK officially closing down in the summer of 2022. But even if NXT UK was finishing up, that didn't mean the North American branch of the developmental brand couldn't still get one big show out of the whole thing, with this being exactly what led us to the Worlds Collide show on September 4th, 2022, where all the NXT and NXT UK belts would be unified. When it came to the top prizes for each respective show then, this meant it would be NXT champion Bron Breakker going up against NXT United Kingdom champion Tyler Bate. And for as great as Bate was, and continues to be, in the end, there was no way he was going to win against Bron. So once it was all said and done, Breakker would be the man holding both belts aloft then, and as they were unified from there on in, it also meant he'd be the last person we'd ever see in possession of the NXT UK brand's biggest prize. Is there a chance we ever see this one make a comeback? Sure, we suppose it's possible, if Triple H ever decides to restart his plans for creating new worldwide branches of NXT once more. But until that happens, we think it's pretty safe to say the NXT United Kingdom Championship is gone, and we won't be seeing it again. But that wasn't the only belt the brand had, of course. In fact, it wasn't even the only world title, as there was also the NXT United Kingdom Women's Championship, with the last person to hold this being Mandy Rose. Yes, like with the men's belt, the NXT UK Women's title was a casualty of the British side of things closing its doors in the summer of 2022. And that's a real shame because, again, like with the men's title, this belt had a pretty proud, if ultimately short, lineage. Need an example of just how proud this lineage was? Well, just look at the fact that its first two holders were Rhea Ripley and Toni Storm, two of the most over women in all of wrestling right now. By the time it came to Worlds Collide in November of that year, though, the same Worlds Collide show where Bron Breakker beat Tyler Bate, it would be Japanese-born star Miko Satomura who was in possession of the gold after she'd beaten Kaylee Ray for it 2 years prior. That's right, this was quite a lengthy run, but a fitting one for the former Red Belt champion in Stardom, as she truly was, and is, one of the best women's performers out there. In the end, though, she proved to be no match for Mandy Rose because at this point in time, she was in the midst of her own 413-day run as NXT Women's Champion, and was being set up for seemingly big things in the future by WWE management. So when Rose and Satomura met on September 4th, 2022 then, it would be the former who came out the victor after 13 minutes and 17 seconds. And as she lifted both belts above her head after that, she did so safe in the knowledge that no one else would ever get to carry the UK version of this strap again following this. And while she may now have left the promotion, the fact remains that Mandy Rose will always be the final NXT United Kingdom Women's Champion, providing the WWE doesn't choose to revive the brand at some point down the line. But those aren't the only examples of a belt largely defended in NXT which went on to be deactivated in 2022, as the same thing happened in January of that year when the last holder of the NXT Cruiserweight title became Carmelo Hayes. Yes, this is the more modern version of the Cruiserweight title we're talking about here, not the one from the 90s and 2000s, which was defended in both WCW and WWE, as the lineage of that one formally ended in 2007 when Hornswoggle was holding it. No, this belt had an entirely different end to it, as after the belt moved away from being a Raw title and then moving on to get its own show in 205 Live, the title would eventually become exclusive to NXT in 2019. With its lineage having some pretty great performers hold it, performers such as Santos Escobar, Kushida, and Roderick Strong. In the end though, none of these people would be the last person to hold this particular prize, as on the January 4th, 2022 episode of NXT, entitled New Year's Evil, incoming champion Strong would defend against NXT North American champion Carmelo Hayes in a unification match. And while Roddy is great, even he wasn't good enough to overcome the power of him on that night, which was exactly why, after 15.5 minutes, it was Hayes who came out on top, and as a result, was able to call himself the last ever NXT Cruiserweight Champion. Would it have been nice to see him defend it for a little while after this? Sure, but that just wasn't in the plans at that time, presumably because WWE wanted to cut down on the amount of titles they had. So we'll just have to settle for the idea that Carmelo got to call himself Cruiserweight Champion for a few minutes at least, and as it stands in the record books, he'll remain the final stop when it comes to that lineage. Hell, even if WWE decides to ever revive this particular piece of hardware, as they've been known to do before, there's still a pretty good chance they'll restart the lineage from scratch this time. So Carmelo will probably still be the last champ in that specific incarnation, but while there's every possibility we'll see the Cruiserweight title again one day, one title we almost certainly won't see again will be the Light Heavyweight title, which was last held by X-Pac in 2001. Why is that? Well, why would WWE need this one anymore? Especially if the Cruiserweight equivalent was an option. After all, the only reason this belt was ever brought over to the WWF in the first place was so the company could try to compete with what WCW were doing in that same division during the mid to late 90s. And we say brought over because the WWF Light Heavyweight Championship did actually exist prior to this, though only as a belt defended in Mexico and Japan for promotions such as the Universal Wrestling Association, Michinoku Pro Wrestling, and in Japan. But while there might have been some prestige to the light heavyweight title at this point, by the time it made its way stateside in late 1997, it quickly became clear that it wasn't going to be a patch on what was happening in WCW. And that was evident in the way it was treated during its last days, as after winning the belt from Jeff Hardy on the August 19, 2001 episode of Raw, X-Pac never defended it on TV. And after a while, he just stopped bringing it down to the ring with him altogether. That's right, there was no grand send-off here. In fact, there was no send-off at all, as after months of fans wondering what was going on with it, WWE quietly announced that the belt had been deactivated on March 8, 2002, when Sean Waltman went down due to injury. Should more have been done with this one in terms of giving it a fond farewell? Maybe, but then it was never treated all that fondly in the first place by management or by fans. So perhaps this is the most fitting way for the story of the light heavyweight title to end, not with a bang, but with a whimper. And like we said a moment ago, don't expect this one to come back anytime soon, as there really is no reason for WWE to revive it anymore, meaning that X-Pac will likely always be able to say he was the last person to hold it. Still, it could have been worse because at least this belt was officially sanctioned by the company, the same of which could never be said for our next entry, the $1 Million title. And that's because this one was always technically unofficial when it comes to the record books, even when it was being held by its last champion, Cameron Grimes. Yes, as far back in 1989 when Ted DiBiase decided that, in his frustration over not being able to buy the WWF World title, he was going to create his own, the $1 Million title has always lived under the radar somewhat as an unofficial renegade belt, not that dissimilar to the way the FTW title is treated in AEW today. It doesn't matter who held it during that first run, whether it be Virgil, Steve Austin, or DiBiase himself, the reality was always the same. And even when the title briefly returned in 2010, when Ted DiBiase Jr. was awarded the belt by his father, the championship was never quite considered fully a canon prize within the company, with it never really being defended. No, the biggest thing of note that happened during this era of the belt's lineage was that Goldust would steal the title and then return it back to DiBiase Sr., with him attempting to award it back to his son, all before DiBiase Jr. decided he no longer wanted it. So this also meant that when the belt came back in 2021, now being an NXT exclusive, it was still treated as something not formally recognized in the record books. So when then-champion L.A. Knight went into battle with Cameron Grimes on TakeOver 36 on August 22nd of that year then, it was less about winning a piece of hardware that was going to change the trajectory of one of the wrestlers' careers, and more about simple pride. Of course, come the end of things, this pride would be worn proudly by everyone's favorite stock market master, as after a bout which waged on for 13.5 minutes, it was him who came out the victor. And while at that point you might have expected Grimes to go on something of a run as champion, he decided instead not to do so, as on the following week's episode of NXT, it was revealed that DiBiase had switched out the new champ's belt with a replica and had driven off with the original, which we guess in a way makes him the last champion? It's really unclear, but given the fuzzy history of this one, it was always going to be. And as there's a pretty decent chance we see it pop up again someday, that fuzziness will likely continue to be an issue. But whatever happens in the future, as it stands right now, we're going to call Cameron Grimes the last $1 million champion, as he was the final person to win it in the ring. And the same goes for the logic behind who the last European champion was too, because the final person to win this in the ring was none other than Rob Van Dam. Now, if you were watching Raw during the early 2000s, then you might remember the period where WWE decided to unify midcard titles with the world title. Yes, over the course of a couple of months in the summer of that year, we saw the hardcore European and Intercontinental titles all disappear from TV entirely, with only the IC title ever returning to WWE as an active prize to this day. The one we want to focus on here is not the hardcore or Intercontinental titles, however, rather it's the European title, the one that was created in 1997 for the British Bulldog and basically served as the prototype for what would later become the NXT United Kingdom title years later. And that's because while this one might have started out with some promise, by the time the turn of the millennium came around, it was seen as pretty much third rate. So when it came time to unify it with the IC strap on the July 22nd, 2002 episode of Raw, not many fans really batted an eyelid. No, for the most part, people were okay with this belt disappearing. The only question people had, in fact, was who was going to be the person holding it when it was finally deactivated. Would it be incoming champion Jeff Hardy, or would it be then Intercontinental champion Rob Van Dam? Well, the answer to that question is RVD. Yes, after getting the better of Hardy in a ladder match that evening, Mr. Monday Night would walk out with both sets of gold, with this being the last time we'd ever see the European title on our screens to this day. Of course, such success wouldn't last for long because just 22 days later he'd be defeated by Chris Jericho, and just a month after that, all the mid-card belts would be merged into Triple H's Ultimate Reign of Terror prize. Yes, it was an anticlimactic end to the title, and one that has gone forgotten by many fans today, but at least we're past that now and can look back on not only the European title fondly, but also all of the other titles we've looked at today. Given there are so many titles in wrestling, it's understandable that some reigns are going to go forgotten, as they just don't leave us with anything memorable to grasp onto. But what are the most notable examples of this in WWE history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the time Shotzi Blackheart and Ember Moon became NXT Women's Tag Team Champions. Why was this one so forgettable? Well, the pair never really established themselves as a team for very long before winning the belts, and once they did get the titles, their reign wasn't long either. And on top of that, the duo had no real memorable moments from their run together. Yes, this was yet another example of the thrown-together duo who had very little in common and was only together to keep the belts warm for a while, with their reigns starting on the March 10th, 2021 episode of NXT, mere minutes after Dakota Kai and Raquel Gonzalez had been crowned inaugural champions. And after they won the belts, Shotzi and Ember proceeded to do nothing with them for the next 55 days. In fact, the most notable thing which happened during their time as champions at all was when they lost them to The Way on May 4th. Still, at least this established the pair as a great new team within the WWE system, right? Well, not quite, because after losing their gold, the Californian and the Texan would go their separate ways, with these separate ways being the main roster for Shotzi, where she's most recently found herself in a feud with Damage Control, and AEW for Ember Moon, where she's since reverted back to her old name of Athena. So even if their tag team title run together was a bit of a wash, things worked out in the end for the unlikely pair. But not all forgotten tag team champions in NXT are makeshift duos. No, some are already established before winning the belts, as was the case with our next subjects, MSK. Of course, MSK's time with the NXT tag team titles has been spread across 2 runs, but while that first one certainly had its issues, mostly because of the time period it happened in, it's the second one we want to focus on today, as that's the one which has really gone forgotten in the years since. Why is this? Well, it's certainly not a lack of talent from the 2 men involved. No, Wesley and Nash Carter were always great, and this is something that they'd repeatedly proved during their time working in TNA as the Rascals prior. Unfortunately though, when they joined NXT, it was during the days of the empty arena era, meaning they never really felt like they got a chance to shine as bright as they could have. And this was never more evident than during their second run with the tag team straps, a run which came in the spring of 2022. After all, this was the reign that lasted for all of 5 days before it came to a crashing and sudden end, with such a short period of time causing the pair to have no opportunity to do anything with the belts other than effectively transition them over from Imperium to Pretty Deadly. Why were they stripped of their gold here? Well, because Nash Carter had been fired after getting himself into a behind-the-scenes controversy. And so, like that, the time of MSK in WWE came to a crashing end. Or at least it would for a while, because in recent weeks, with NXT and TNA's relationship starting to bloom, it's meant we've been able to see something of a Rascals reunion on NXT. And who knows, maybe this means they'll even finally be able to get that memorable run with the tag team gold on the developmental brand at some point. But they're not the only team still looking for a memorable run to make up for a forgettable prior one, as despite their greatness, few teams have had as poor of an NXT tag team title run as Mustache Mountain. Yes, if you were an NXT fan during the Black and Gold era, then you knew how great the duo made up of Tyler Bate and Trent Seven were. It didn't matter if it was on the UK branch of the show or the US one, they always delivered every time they stepped in the ring. And the way they did this was by bringing their British strong style with them and utilizing it so well, there were few who could match up to them once the bell rang. So you think it would be a given the 2 boys from Wolverhampton would get a significant tag team title reign then, right? Well, while they would get this with the NXT UK tag team titles, with their time with these belts lasting for 174 days, when it came to the US versions of the same gold, that one would be far shorter lived and far less eventful. What happened here exactly? To put it bluntly, the Undisputed Era happened. That's right, back during late 2010's NXT, the foursome made up of Adam Cole, Kyle O'Reilly, Bobby Fish, and Roderick Strong absolutely dominated the Black and Gold brand. And this domination meant they were usually in possession of the tag team titles, which was exactly why it felt like such a big moment when Mustache Mountain beat them for the gold on June 19, 2018 in their home country of England. Unfortunately for the Englishmen though, this run on top would prove to be incredibly short-lived, as just 22 days later on an episode of NXT back over in America, they dropped them right back to Kyle O'Reilly and Roderick Strong, with this meaning they had absolutely no time to do anything with the titles while they had them. And because of that, Mustache Mountain's time as NXT Tag Team Champions has since pretty much gone forgotten. But let's move away from the Black and Gold brand for a moment now, and over to the main roster. As it's there, we find our next subject, Randy Orton, and the time he became United States Champion. Now, when you think of all the times Randy Orton has held gold around his waist throughout his illustrious career, it's easy to think of those times he was the World Champion. After all, there are 14 options to choose from there. And if you don't think of that, then you might even think of his early Intercontinental title reign, which saw him memorably feud with Mick Foley, that or his tag team title runs with Edge or Matt Riddle. What you probably don't think about, though, is the time he was United States Champion in 2018, as this has since gone so forgotten, it's hard to remember it happened at all. So what was the story here? Why was the Viper given the midcard belt so late into his career? Well, it appears this was a case of WWE trying to raise the profile of the belt by giving it to a legitimate main eventer for a while. Unfortunately though, the run Orton went on here was so short-lived, it did little to revive the prestige of the once prized gold. Hell, it only lasted 27 days, and during those 27 days, Randy was able to do nothing of note with it. Yes, between winning it from Bobby Roode at March 11th's Fastlane, and then losing it to Jinder Mahal at April 8th's WrestleMania 34, the highlights of his run were nowhere to be found. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that in the years since, Orton has never regained the title. And it's not like he's been left out in the cold because of that, because a man of his status is always going to find something else to occupy himself with. But Randy Orton's United States title run isn't the only hugely forgettable mid-card run in relatively recent WWE history, as the exact same thing could be said about the time CM Punk became Intercontinental Champion in 2009. Yes, you could argue that almost any Intercontinental title run from this period is forgettable, as it was the point where the least care was being given to a belt that had once been so proudly held by the likes of Macho Man Randy Savage, Bret the Hitman Hart, and Mr. Perfect. But even by the standards of forgettable late 2000s, early 2010s reigns with the IC strap, this one takes the cake. And the reason it takes the cake is because CM Punk holding a title back then should have felt like a big deal. Sure, he was still a few years away from dropping a pipe bomb and reaching the main event, but Punk was clearly a star in waiting by the time 2009 rolled around, something which was evident in the fact he'd already held the World Heavyweight title once. So you'd think he'd have been able to do something to elevate the secondary prize here. But alas, back then, the Intercontinental title held very little value. And so, for the 49 days Pepsi Phil held it here, nothing of note happened. Of course, it also didn't help that mere months later, Punk would start his second of 3 runs with the World Heavyweight title, and with that belt being considered much more important at the time, it was quickly seen as the real attempt to elevate the Chicago native. So because of this, it was even easier to forget he'd ever been Intercontinental Champion at all, and much easier to completely file this one away into the bargain bin of history. Could things have been different if Punk had been given a good story to work with during his run? Could it have maybe elevated the gold back up to the levels it deserved to be at, years before Gunther managed to do this once more? It's hard to say, but there's certainly a possibility we could have been looking at the IC strap as being something important again heading into the 2010s if things had played out differently. But instead, what we got was what we got. And the reign which followed this would only make things worse, as that was the reign of JBL. Yes, when most fans think of JBL, they likely associate him with his time as a WWE champion on SmackDown in the mid-2000s, and if they're not thinking of that, they'd probably think of the times he'd held the tag team belts with Farouk back at the turn of the millennium. What most are almost certainly not thinking of, however, is the time John Bradshaw Layfield held the Intercontinental title back in 2009. But to be fair to JBL, it's not like he had any opportunity to do much of note during his reign, as after beating CM Punk for the gold on the March 9th, 2009 episode of Raw, he'd only hold on to it for 26 days before dropping it to Rey Mysterio at WrestleMania 25 in what turned out to be his final match. So why was he given the belt at all here? Was it a way of saying thank you and giving him a metaphorical gold watch before he hung up his boots? Was it a way of using his heel status to transition the title between two babyfaces? Probably a little from column A and a little from column B, if we're being honest. Whatever the reason, the reality was the same in the end, and that reality was that this was a title reign few had any reason to care about. And so because of that, it should come as no surprise it's been largely forgotten. Hell, even the ending was underwhelming, as it saw the Texan get beaten by Mysterio in just 21 seconds. Still, at least things would eventually turn around for the IC strap, though it would take a while for us to get to that point. That said, when it was having a revival of fortunes during the 2020s, other belts were having their own spells of being devalued. And one of the most prominent examples of this happening can be found in the time Nikki ASH became Raw Women's Champion in 2021. Yes, considering this one happened so recently, and considering it happened on the main roster, the fact it's since gone forgotten by many fans should tell you everything you need to know about this one. After all, when someone wins a world title on WWE's flagship show, it should feel like a big deal. Unfortunately, in the case of Nikki ASH, however, her run with the gold back at the turn of the decade cannot be described as memorable. Why is that? Well, because there was nothing of note that happened during the reign. The reason this one happened at all, in fact, was because a few months prior, Nikki had won the Money in the Bank contract, with this guaranteeing her a title shot at a time of her choosing. So obviously not wanting to have someone lose their cash-in attempt that year, the company chose to have the Scotswoman defeat Charlotte Flair when she cashed in on her during the July 19th episode of Raw that year. The only problem with this was, with there clearly being no follow-up plans for the almost a superhero, her subsequent run with the gold provided nothing worth talking about, and no great matches worthy of note. Now all that happened here was the new champ held on to the belt for 32 days, and then dropped it back to Charlotte again at SummerSlam. Obviously then, this did not elevate Nikki to the main event level, and it didn't help to add to the history of the belt either. Really, it's hard to think of a modern-day title reign that failed so much. Hell, so much damage would it do, it wouldn't be until Nikki ASH reverted back to Nikki Cross and joined the Wyatt Six 3 years later that she felt like she was able to regain her momentum. Of course, this isn't the only forgettable women's title reign that has happened on WWE TV in recent years. No, far from it. In order to look back at the other one, though, we have to venture back to developmental, as that's where we'll find Indi Hartwell's ill-fated run with the NXT Women's title back in 2023. Now, considering how high Triple H appeared to be on Indi Hartwell when he was booking NXT, you'd have thought that big things were in her future in 2023. After all, she was a major focus for a while there, in that her storyline with Dexter Lumis was one of the top angles on 2.0. And so, her finally winning the gold should have felt like a crowning moment then, a sign that she'd finally arrived and was ready to lead a division. Except this is not what happened. Rather, when the Melbourne native won a ladder match at April 1st's Stand and Deliver show that year, she would have a run which lasted all of 31 days and which gave us nothing memorable, all before she then vacated it on May 2nd. But to be fair to Indi, this wasn't exactly her fault. No, the failure of her title run to be remembered had less to do with her talents and more to do with factors beyond her control. What were these factors? Well, they were twofold. First, there was the fact that almost immediately after winning the belt, the new champ suffered a foot injury, meaning she was not going to be cleared to step into the ring in the immediate future. And as if that wasn't a bad enough sign for her NXT Women's title reign, there was also the fact that during the 2023 draft, she'd be called up to Raw, with this meaning she wasn't going to be available to show up on Tuesday nights any longer. It should go without saying then that both of these factors combined meant there was no possibility of Hartwell's time with the developmental gold lasting any longer. And so this was why we got the moment we got where she relinquished the belt only a month after winning it. Could things have been different if she hadn't got injured or called up so soon? Yeah, we have no doubt she would have had a decent run, certainly something that would have been better remembered by fans than what actually happened. But that's not the way things worked out. No, instead, this is yet another title reign which has been forgotten to time. And the NXT Women's title wasn't alone in this respect during the early 2020s, as that brand's men's world title had the same thing happening to it in 2022 when Dolph Ziggler briefly won it. Now, to tell this story, we have to tell the story of where NXT was as a whole in 2022. Yes, this was not long after the rebrand from the Black and Gold era to the 2.0 era. And with this new era came an all-new focus then. Less time spent with indie wrestlers, and more time spent with fresh young athletes who could go on to become WWE superstars. So this is why WWE decided to bring Dolph Ziggler to the developmental show and give him a world title run. And it seems that the reason for this was to have an established star on the roster so he could help elevate those young rookies. But then it's not like NXT didn't already have people on the roster who served such a purpose, so there really was no need for the show-off to appear here. But he did, and after immediately challenging then NXT World Champion Braun Breaker to a match at March 8th, 2022's Roadblock show, he'd proceeded to defeat the youngster when it came time for the bell to ring, with this giving Dolph the honor of becoming the 20th NXT champion. What would he do with the belt now that he had it? Well, not a lot if we're being honest, as the purpose here was never for the Ohio native to have a stellar run. No, the purpose was for him to keep the gold warm for a while until it was time to drop it back. And that meant over the 26 days which followed, little of note would take place with that particular belt. In fact, the only thing memorable about this time is that he defended it once against LA Knight. Aside from that, though, it would be a case of killing time until the April 4th episode of Raw, The point where, in front of the biggest stage Braun Breaker had been on at that time, he was able to regain his lost gold from the show-off. Yes, we see what WWE was going for here, to give the rookie a chance to win the title on a more high-profile show with a bigger audience watching him. What's harder to understand, though, is that there was any value to be found in our next forgotten title run, the time Leon Ruff won the NXT North American title. That's right, let us take you back for a moment to 2020. That was when, with no fans in the arena to create an atmosphere, NXT was throwing everything at the wall in an attempt to see what would stick. And one of the things they decided to try at this point was to take someone who was making one of his first ever appearances on WWE TV and have them win a title right away. That was what happened with Leon Ruff when on the November 11th episode of NXT that year, he accepted the challenge from then North American champion Johnny Gargano and proceeded to beat him in what was considered a huge upset at the time. Obviously then, the idea here was to turn Ruff into a star overnight and quickly elevate him up to a higher level. Unfortunately though, this one didn't turn out as well as when the 1-2-3 Kid beat Razor Ramon and went on to become a star. Because as the weeks went on, it quickly became clear that Ruff was not turning into the instant sensation WWE hoped he would be. But then, in his defense, he didn't get much of a chance to prove himself because with a title run which only lasted 25 days, there was little he could do. That's right, the entire time the Detroit native spent as champion was spent with him playing third wheel to a much more focused upon Johnny Gargano, Damian Priest feud. So it wasn't as if fans were given anything to get behind here. And once it was over, it would be straight back to the twilight zone of irrelevance for the rookie, as he spent the rest of his time in WWE doing nothing of note. Should Leon Ruff have been more? Maybe. At very least, his title run should have been given more of a chance to get out of the starting blocks. But that unfortunately wasn't the case, and so instead, it'll always go down as forgotten, just like every other title reign we've looked at today. There was a time when the Intercontinental Championship was the most prized belt out there to great in-ring performers. After all, it was the belt held by the real workhorse wrestlers, people like Macho Man Randy Savage, Bret Hart, and Mr. Perfect. But over time, the IC strap would lose a lot of its luster, and part of the reason for this was because of some truly terrible reigns. But what are the worst runs with the Intercontinental title belt of all time? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the time Road Dogg held the title in 1999. Yes, in between the period where then rising stars such as Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock were fighting over the secondary strap in 1997, and high-level performers like Kurt Angle and Chris Jericho were trying to wrestle it away from one another in 2000, there was 1999, the first point the IC title really started to lose what made it special. And that was because this was the period that not only did it start bouncing around from person to person a lot more, but it started falling into the hands of people it would never have before. In fact, one of the people that this statement applies to the most is Road Dogg. As well, he was very over during the Attitude Era and was always great on the mic, his skills were never as an in-ring performer. And prior to this, that had always been a hallmark of what made a great Intercontinental Champion, the ability to go in the ring. So needless to say then, once he won the belt from Val Venus, it marked a quick drop in the quality of the work you'd see associated with it, as Brian James just wasn't that kind of performer. No, he was more suited to quick Crash TV style bouts, which had none of the technical prowess of anything involving a Ricky the Dragon Steamboat or a ravishing Rick Rude. Hell, it wasn't even as if it had the star power of an Ultimate Warrior or a Rowdy Roddy Piper because, while again, Road Dogg was very over during this time period, he remained a mid-card act regardless. Really, if he was winning any belts back then, it should have been a hardcore title or even a European title, something lower down on the pecking order without the same kind of lineage. And the same could sadly be said for his former partner as it happens too, because while he was a much better wrestler when it came time for the bell to ring, Billy Gunn's run with the IC strap never amounted to much either. Why was this? Well, let's be honest. At least part of the reason the current day daddy ass failed to get over as a singles champion in 2000 was The Rock. After all, once he won the King of the Ring in June that year, it looked like the world was Gunn's oyster. But during the lead-up to his bout with the Great One at SummerSlam a couple of months later, any steam he'd been building up was destroyed with one single promo. So when it came time to coronate him as Intercontinental Champion in November by having him beat Eddie Guerrero, few people really cared anymore. And this meant it was hard for anyone to get invested in any of his matches, especially as they weren't on the level people had been accustomed to seeing throughout that year. That's right, in 2000 alone, we'd already seen Jericho, Angle, and Guerrero hold the strap. So even if he was a step up from the Road Dogg, when put amongst talent like this, the one, Billy Gunn, just couldn't cut it. No, as we've seen time and time again throughout his career, he can be great in a tag team or trios situation, but whenever you ask the former New Age outlaw to go it solo, it just never manages to connect as it should. And that's a shame because, had things been a little different, he could have been a very worthy Intercontinental Champion. Hell, he certainly looked like a big star at the time, and he had the charisma required for such a spot. We'd go as far as to say that if this one came a few years later when the belt was in even more dire straits, then Billy's run might have been looked back on more fondly than it is. But when it's sandwiched in between the likes of Latino Heat and Triple H, there's just no way you can consider it on the same level. But Billy Gunn wasn't the only wrestler of the Attitude Era who underwhelmed when it came to holding on to the once prized gold at the turn of the millennium and trying to keep relevant in the process. And that's because in June of the following year, things would reach another level of bad when Albert became champion. Now, this didn't have to be a terrible idea, as on the face of things, after all, Albert was something of a rising star in WWF at the time, certainly a performer who management appeared to see potential in as a single star. And with the Intercontinental belt still holding some of its cachet back then, there was every reason to assume giving it to him would help elevate him to that next level. So why did such an idea fail then? Well, have you ever heard of the phrase, the man makes the title, not the title makes the man? Yeah, the secondary prize could have elevated the future Lord Tensai had he been up to the task. But pretty soon after he beat Kane to take it home on July 26th of that year, it became clear that he wasn't the guy for the job. No, like with Road Dogg, what Albert specialized in was having pretty basic matches which had little heat. And to make matters worse, he never even had the mic skills the Road Dogg had in order to make up for such in-ring deficiencies. So because of this, whenever he defended his title during his completely forgettable reign, it would put the audience to sleep, as no one could have cared less about seeing him on their screen. And sure, it didn't help that this was around the time that he had the stink of X Factor on him, one of the worst factions of all time, with hands down the worst entrance music ever recorded. But even if you take X Factor out of the equation, the fact remains Albert just wasn't someone who should have been winning the Intercontinental Championship at any point of his career, as all this served to do was bring the belt down rather than rise him up. That said, WWF were all in on him at the time, so they tried this anyway, even if it was always destined to be a failure. And it wasn't as if they learned their lesson afterwards either, because later on that same year they'd make the exact same mistake when they had Test win the gold. Now, Test is an interesting case because, again, on the surface of things, he had all the elements required to be a star in WWF. He was big, had a good look, could talk on the mic to some degree, and while he wasn't Shawn Michaels in the ring, he could have a decent match considering the time period he was wrestling in. Sadly though, for one reason or another, things never quite clicked with him as a single star, no matter how hard the company tried to turn him into one. Why was this? Well, there's a number of potential causes. Maybe Triple H taking his place as the on-screen husband of Stephanie McMahon in 1999 killed his momentum. Or maybe it was a case of his spot being better filled by better wrestlers like some of the ones we've mentioned already. Whatever the reason, by the time we got to the end of the Invasion angle in late 2001, it was clear that Andrew Martin was becoming lost in the shuffle. So that's why it was baffling in many ways that WWF chose this as the moment to finally coronate him as IC champ. Yes, it's another reign which was certainly hurt on account of when it happened. Hell, had it happened in 1999 instead, then maybe Test would have fared better. By 2001, though, he was destined to fail, especially as the man he'd taken it from, Edge, was so much more over than he was, and was basically a better version of him in many ways. Seriously, both of them were big, long-haired blonde Canadians who built at least part of their appeal on being athletic figures that the ladies could enjoy watching. The big difference, though, was that even back then, Adam Copeland oozed star power and had charisma to burn in a way the former Union member never did. And maybe that's why, after a run which only lasted 13 days, Test would drop the belt right back to the man he'd won it from again, allowing WWF to go on almost as if no title change had ever happened at all. But as for insignificant as this reign turned out to be, even it has nothing on the run our next champion had, because his lasted less than an hour. Who are we talking about here? Why, Dean Douglas, of course. Yes, you could argue that in the lineage of the Intercontinental title, a belt which had existed for 16 years by the time Douglas won it, this was the first truly bad reign, and a sign that not all was going to be well for what it represented in the years to come. Sure, this isn't necessarily the former ECW World Champion's fault, as he didn't even get a chance to do anything with it. But nevertheless, he was the man who had the reign, and so it's him who's always going to be associated with it, not the booking team. Could it have been better if he had been given an opportunity to have an actual run? Sure, Douglas was always capable both in the ring and on the mic, so there's no reason he couldn't have had some feuds against the likes of Shawn Michaels or Jeff Jarrett. But alas, that was not to be, and because of this, he'll always go down in history as the man who held the belt for a shorter period of time than it takes to watch an episode of The Simpsons. Of course, that all begs the question then, why give it to him at all? Why do Dean like that if the company never had any intention of it going anywhere? Well, the answer to this can be found in 2 words: the click. Yes, like with so many other people in mid-90s WWF, Dean Douglas became a victim of the politicking of Shawn Michaels and his friends. That's right, HBK was supposed to drop the belt to his opponent at In Your House 4, Great White North, but after getting beaten up by a bunch of Marines a few days prior, he wasn't cleared to compete. So this meant Douglas would simply be awarded the belt once the time came for the match to begin. And sure, while that wasn't a great start to his run, he could have made the best of it, but this never happened, as immediately thereafter, he'd be told he was defending it against Shawn's friend Razor Ramon, with Ramon proceeding to absolutely job the Pittsburgh native out in 11 minutes. But it isn't the only short-lived reign which has earned itself a spot on our video today. No, our next one qualifies in such a category too, as it happens. That's right, it's time to talk about the Mountie. Now again, the Mountie becoming Intercontinental Champion back in 1992 didn't have to be a terrible idea, as he was a pretty decent wrestler and good enough character for the time. Hell, Jacques Rougeau, the man behind the gimmick, had long since proven he had what it took to be a player in WWF during his lengthy run as part of the Fabulous Rougeaus alongside his brother Raymond. So why was this title run such a flop then? Well, like with Dean Douglas, he didn't get a chance to do anything with it. No, the only reason he won the belt at all, in fact, was so he could act as a transitional champion after Bret Hart fell ill with the flu. Yes, this one can all be blamed on an unwell hitman, as it was in the lead up to that year's Royal Rumble that Bret caught a bug and was not going to be able to get himself well enough in time to step into the ring for his planned pay-per-view bout against Rowdy Roddy Piper. And that was why, realizing he had to pivot then, Vince McMahon had the excellence of execution drop it in a quick squash at a house show on January 17th, with the man who beat him for it here being none other than the Mountie. But while this marked a high point for Jacques Rougeau as a singles performer, it wasn't destined to be a lengthy reign, as just 2 days later at the Royal Rumble, he'd be the one to face off against Piper. And as had always been planned, the kayfabe Scotsman would win this one, giving him his first singles gold in WWF ever. And after that, Bret came back and put on a clinic with Roddy at WrestleMania 8 in what was, at the time, one of the best pure wrestling bouts ever seen inside a Fed ring. And while they were doing this, the Mountie was being completely forgotten about, with him instead being part of a throwaway 8-man tag, which also featured the Big Boss Man, Virgil, Sergeant Slaughter, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, the Nasty Boys, and the Repo Man. That's right, while it was done out of necessity, the unintentional after effect of having Jacques Rougeau have such an uncharacteristically short run with the IC strap, considering the time period he was in, was that he looked like an absolute geek. Such a geek that fans would find it hard to take him seriously as a real threat again afterwards. But that's not the worst example of someone looking like a complete jobber despite holding what was supposed to be one of the top titles in the entire company, as years later, the exact same thing would happen to an even greater degree when Curtis Axel won it. Curtis Axel. No matter what he did in WWE, he always came out looking bad by the end of things. It didn't matter if it was his time as part of a comedy act alongside Bo Dallas or his infamous Genesis of McGillicuddy promo. Everything he touched had a habit of not working out as intended. And that's why everyone should have seen it coming then when, in 2013, he was brought back as the newest Paul Heyman guy, and from there, proceeded to absolutely kill the idea that anyone associated with the former ECW owner was destined for stardom. Yes, unlike Heyman's runs with the likes of Brock Lesnar and CM Punk, this one didn't get over with fans. Why did it fail? Well, for all WWE seemed intent on pushing Axel here, he was never really treated like a star. Hell, even when he beat Triple H during his first match back, it was purely on a technicality, as the game had kayfabe collapsed outside the ring and gotten himself counted out. So when it came time to actually coronate the son of Mr. Perfect then, he didn't really feel like a big enough deal to be someone who could hold the gold, even gold that was as worthless as the IC strap was back in 2013. It didn't matter if he'd beat both Wade Barrett and The Miz for it in a triple threat bout at that June's Payback, fans just weren't in on Curtis having a thimbleful of the talent his father had. And so as he proceeded to hold it for 155 days following this, it basically became a forgotten part of the show, with most people only noticing again once Big E mercifully beat the champ for his gold on an episode of Raw that November. Yes, the 2010s were a particularly dark time for the belt once prized as being bigger than the world title to some. And if you need another example of why this is, you only have to look to our next subject. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Ryback? That's right, back in the early 2010s, Ryback was a wrestler who at one point looked like he was poised to be the next breakout star of the WWE. That was until he got beat by CM Punk in a Hell in a Cell match and all his momentum was ended. So in an attempt to try and rebuild this momentum then, WWE had him win the Intercontinental title in an Elimination Chamber bout at May 31st, 2015's titular pay-per-view just a few weeks after Daniel Bryan had been forced to vacate due to injury. And it's there that things got off to the worst start imaginable, as this was the same match where everything completely fell apart at one point when Mark Henry's chamber pod broke. But it wasn't like his run got better from there, because with this being mid-2010s WWE, the big guy wasn't exactly getting a lot of quality stories written for him. And with him not even being a tenth as over as he had been a few years prior, it meant there was little reason to get excited about anything he was doing. No, if we're being honest, it's very easy to forget this run ever happened because, like so many others we've looked at today, absolutely nothing of note took place during it. Hell, outside of that disaster of an Elimination Chamber bout, the most memorable thing about it was that it was Kevin Owens who eventually dethroned Ryback in September of that same year to start his own run on top. And while Owens would manage to bring at least some semblance of prestige back to the once highly prized title, this was all but undone again in April of 2016, as that's when Zack Ryder held it for a cup of coffee. Now don't get us wrong, we love Zack Ryder. It doesn't matter if it's his run as Long Island Iced Z back in 2011, where he got monumentally over for a time, or his current day spell in GCW and Impact as Matt Cardona, King of the Indies. Ryder has always been great. But the problem with him is that he was booked so badly by WWE for so long that at a certain point, no matter how much people wanted to see him succeed, it was impossible to take him seriously as a legitimate threat anymore. Hell, so bad was it that when he was entered into a multi-man ladder match for the Intercontinental title at WrestleMania 32, no one thought he had a chance of winning. After all, this was the same match that also included the likes of Sami Zayn, Cody Rhodes, and Kevin Owens. But to the shock of pretty much everyone watching, Ryder would get the victory here and start his first run with the secondary strap, a run we all hoped would finally see him get his due, except it wouldn't. Because the very next night on Raw, he'd drop it to The Miz, making us all wonder what the point of him winning it had been in the first place. Was it a case of giving him a metaphorical gold watch for all his time served in the company by having him come out victorious on the grandest stage of them all? Possibly. But if that were the case, then surely it still made no sense to have him lose it just 24 hours later. Hell, all this did was make his win look like a fluke and have him come across as someone who still couldn't really cut it as a champion. But let's move away from this time period for now, because if Zack Ryder marks the most recent example of a bad Intercontinental champion we're going to be looking at today, our next entry marks the earliest. Yes, get in your time machines, because we're about to go all the way back to 1996 to check in on the sad case of Wildman Mark Marrow. Why was this so sad? Well, because by all rights, it should have been great. In fact, it should have been enough to catapult Marrow into the upper echelon of the New York scene. Seriously, so high was Vince McMahon on the Buffalo native at this point, he'd sign him to a big money guaranteed contract. The first time this had ever happened in WWF for anyone who wasn't a top of the card performer like Hulk Hogan. Unfortunately though, not long after Marrow hit the scene in early 1996, it became apparent he wasn't going to be everything the boss had hoped he might be, as he was almost immediately overshadowed by his wife Sable. Yes, before the Wildman could even get a chance to establish himself in this new company, the fans had decided that Sable was the bigger star. So while WWF went all in on turning Reno Marrow into a huge deal then, Mark Marrow was left to flounder as his Intercontinental title reign gave us nothing of note, not even a single entertaining match or storyline. And as if this wasn't bad enough, Only 28 days after it began, it would be over, when on the October 21st episode of Raw that year, Hunter Hearst Helmsley toppled the champ and started his own first reign on top, a reign which led the game to much greater success than the former Johnny B. Bad would ever sniff. But Mark Marrow shouldn't feel too bad about this because, as we've seen today, he's not the only failed Intercontinental Champion whose career hit a roadblock after the fact. And that just goes to show how important proving yourself with this particular belt can be then, because if you can't cut the mustard with it, then you probably can't cut the mustard with anything higher up on the card either. The United States title has had quite a history. After all, this is the same belt that John Cena once so memorably elevated with his weekly Open Challenge, and it's also the same belt that Booker T and Chris Benoit fought over in a Best of 7 series back on 2006 SmackDown. But not all title reigns are created equal. No, some are just outright terrible and do nothing but devalue the belt. But what are the worst of these in WWE history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the time Dean Ambrose won it in the spring of 2013. Of course, the problem here wasn't that he had snagged the secondary prize. No, he was already a superstar in the making at this point, and so him holding on to it for almost a full year between May of 2013 and May of 2014 should have been enough to elevate it somewhat. The only issue was that Ambrose never really defended the belt. Yes, while his Shield stablemates Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins would frequently put their tag team titles on the line, the Lunatic Fringe seemed to forget he had his own belt at some point, and that was why he barely ever got around to putting it up for grabs in a match. Seriously, over the 351 days he would be champion, he defended it a total of 7 times on TV, an achievement that would make even the current-day tribal chief look up and tell his old friend that he needed to come to work occasionally. Sure, it was regularly defended on the house show circuit during this time, but that's never really been part of the on-screen canon in WWE. So that means that what we're left with was a situation where one of the hottest young rising stars in the industry had a belt around his waist he could have really done something with, but due to questionable booking of said belt, the whole thing ended up going nowhere. Hell, even when he lost the title, no one would get the rub of beating him, as it happened in a battle royal designed to screw Ambrose after he and the rest of the Shield had turned on the Authority. So in the end, this has to rank as one of the worst US title reigns, if for no other reason than it was so uneventful. But Mox isn't the only man who won this particular piece of hardware and then proceeded to do nothing with it, because back in 2010, the same thing had happened with Bret Hart. Of course, in the Hitman's case, it wasn't as if he could do anything even if he wanted to though, as he was by this point long beyond ever getting cleared to wrestle in an actual match. So how did he win the belt in the first place then? Well, that all happened on the May 17th episode of Raw that year, when in a surprise for the crowd in attendance, Bret was announced as the next challenger to The Miz, the man who was then in possession of the gold. And what followed after that was supposed to be a nice feel-good moment which would see the excellence of execution defeat the champ in short order and prove that he still had it. The only problem was that he didn't still have it. And this was why he couldn't actually take any bumps or perform any moves outside of some punches and a sharpshooter, with it being that which ultimately got him the submission victory. Needless to say then, once the excitement of him getting the win had faded and people realized Bret Hart in 2010 was now US champion, it started to become clear how much of a mistake this may have been, as not only was The Miz made to look like a fool, but the title had been devalued somewhat as well on account of the fact that a no longer active performer with post-concussion syndrome was able to beat the champion with ease. And what's worse, Bret couldn't even defend the belt going forward for obvious reasons. So rather than be able to put someone else over and make the whole thing worthwhile, he was instead forced to vacate the following week on Raw and announce a match which would see a new champion be crowned, a match that was eventually won by R-Truth. And as it happened, that's exactly who we want to talk about next, though it's not this particular reign we have an issue with. No, instead, when we talk about everyone's favorite Ron Killings, it's the time he became US champion in 2019. Why this reign in particular? Well, at least back in 2010, R-Truth still had some semblance of legitimacy to him, but come the end of the decade, it was clear what his role was, and that was as a comedy act. And look, there's nothing wrong with comedy acts in wrestling. They make up some of the most entertaining performers, in fact. Names like Maximum Male Models and Santino Marella. But said acts have a place on the card, and it really shouldn't be clogging up the title scene. No, when someone like R-Truth wins the United States strap in 2019, long after the point he was being taken seriously as a legitimate threat, it tells the audience that the belt is a joke too. And if the belt is a joke, why should we care about watching people fight over it? And to make matters worse, the man Ron Killings beat to win this gold was none other than Shinsuke Nakamura, someone who should have been a perfect person to run as champion back then, as well, he wasn't the same performer he had been back during his days of his IWGP Intercontinental title run in Japan. He was still more than capable of having some hard-hitting bouts and bringing some credibility back to the proceedings. But in 2019, credibility wasn't something WWE were concerned with. And so that was why we had the King of Strong Styles reign be aborted before its time so that R-Truth could have some laughs. And again, this is not a shot at R-Truth. No, we love him as much as the next person, but come on, he has his role, and that role is as a comedy side character, something he's playing to perfection right now as the on and off again member of the Judgment Day. So please, no more belts for him in the future or for comedy acts in general. After all, it's the same reason our next entry has been included in this video, and that's Santino Marella. Yes, Santino is awesome in the sense that he's one of the most legitimately funny wrestlers in WWE history. Hell, he's one of the most legitimately funny wrestlers in the industry's history, in fact. But like with R-Truth, that comedy has a role on the card, and it's not hogging up title scenes. No, it's doing things like having tea parties with Sheamus, or getting into sock puppet wars with Mick Foley. So why WWE thought it was a good idea to further devalue the United States Championship by giving it to the Kayfabe Battalion in 2012 then is anyone's guess, as he was doing just fine without it, and the title would have been doing a lot better without him. Seriously, this was a period where, for as bad as the booking could be in WWE, you at least had the potential of an absolutely stacked mid-card to fight over this prize. Hell, you had names like Cesaro, Cody Rhodes, and Drew McIntyre. So there was no excuse for choosing to instead turn the belt into a joke by having Santino hold it for a full 167 days. And again, we have to stress that like with our feelings on R-Truth, this is not a shot at Marella as he's undeniably awesome. All we're saying is that if we wanted to give performers like them belts back in the 2010s, then maybe we could have created a belt specifically for the purpose, something like the 24/7 title. After all, that piece of hardware was always a joke from day one, so no one batted an eyelid when Truth held it for a total of 54 times. And if it was around in 2012, then no one would have batted an eyelid if Santino Marella had held it dozens of times either. But it wasn't around, and so instead we got him as United States Champion for half a year, meaning that for half a year, that belt was about as worthless as the WWE Women's Tag Team titles are today. That said, it's not all Santino's fault that the US title was worthless in the 2010s, as there were other bad champions during this time period too. And one of them is the next person we're going to be looking at. Who might this be? Why, Alberto Del Rio, of course. That's right, while you might think that on the surface of things, having former two-time WWE champion Alberto Del Rio return to WWE in 2015 and win the secondary prize would be a great way to further elevate it, following the excellent work John Cena had done with the gold, this turned out to be a disaster. Why was that? Well, first of all, it was actually Alberto who beat Cena for the strap at October 25th's Hell in a Cell in a quick throwaway bout that really didn't sell the magnitude of such a legendary reign coming to an end. No, all it told us was that Cena was injured, and so the company had to get the belt off him quickly without him having to have a proper match. And with the former CMLL and AAA World Champion being the one to defeat Big Match John here, it meant no young up-and-comer who could have benefited from getting the rub had the chance to do so. Still, this didn't necessarily mean Del Rio's title reign had to be a disaster going forward. No, even if it had started off weak, it could have still turned into something good as the weeks and months went on. But in the end, this didn't happen as, despite holding it for the next 3 months, he proceeded to do nothing with it, except at one point pass it back and forth between himself and someone else we'll get to in a moment. And so that was why, once he finally dropped it for good at the 2016 Royal Rumble, the belt was right back to the level it had been before Cena won it, and that was pretty much worthless. Yes, it's rare to see such good work be undone so quickly, but never doubt 2010's WWE's ability to turn treasure into trash. Of course, Alberto can't be entirely blamed for this though, as the man he passed the belt back and forth with also has to shoulder some of the blame for making the US title feel unimportant again. That's right, it's time to talk about Kalisto. Now, there are 2 Kalistos out there. And no, we don't mean that in a literal sense like we do with his Lucha Dragons partner Sin Cara. Rather, we mean it symbolically as, while he was wrestling down in Mexico for AAA as Samurai del Sol, Emmanuel Rodriguez was proving himself to be one of the best luchadors on the planet. And then there's the other side of the man, the side we got in WWE, named Carlito. This man was a man who never was allowed to do what made him so special once inside of the WWE system, and so he quickly floundered with less than great matches and terrible promo segments, namely his Good Lucha Things interview. So it's just a shame that when he won the United States title from Alberto Del Rio in 2016 then, it was the latter version of the man we got. And that meant a reign so underwhelming that by the time it was over, people were begging for the strap to be given back to Rusev. Seriously, almost nothing of note would happen during the time Carlito was champion, and because of that, not only was the belt further damaged, but his career trajectory was severely damaged in the process. Hell, whereas there was still a possibility WWE might have seen the Chicago native as a future player back then, after his failed run as US champion, there was no hope of him going any higher up the pecking order ever again. So maybe that was why, once he dropped it, he'd spend the rest of his time in the company either stuck in 205 Live purgatory with the Cruiserweight title, or working as part of a go-nowhere trio alongside Gran Metalik and Lince Dorado called the Lucha House Party. Yes, this was a title reign so damaging it killed any main event aspirations Carlito may have had. And it also killed the credibility of the belt so much that even when the likes of Roman Reigns, Chris Jericho, and Kevin Owens won it not long thereafter, it still felt very much secondary in its nature. But Kalisto's time spent devaluing the US title with Alberto Del Rio wasn't the only example of someone who had followed John Cena and then proceeded to fail to live up to what he'd built up. Because following one of Big Match John's early reigns with the prize back in 2005, the same thing would happen with Orlando Jordan. And for those who don't remember Orlando Jordan, we don't blame you, as he was just about as forgettable of an early 2000s SmackDown wrestler as someone could be. Sure, he featured somewhat prominently at one point when he became a member of JBL's cabinet, but even this wasn't enough to make him stand out. What his membership in this stable was enough to help him do, however, was get a shot at then United States champion John Cena. And the reason for this was because at that point in time, Cena was feuding with JBL and had eyes on his WWE strap. So hoping to get one over on his upcoming opponent then, Layfield hoped to kill his morale by having his lackey Jordan challenge Cena and defeat him to take away his gold. Would this happen? Of course it would. John had bigger fish to fry at that point. The only problem was that once he moved on to the WWE title, the man who took the secondary belt from him did absolutely nothing of note. Seriously, in the annals of United States champions, Orlando Jordan may very well rank as the most inconsequential of them all, as we can't think of a single noteworthy thing he achieved while holding it other than dumping the spinner version of it in the trash. And that's even worse when you consider the fact that his reign went on for 171 days, almost 6 full months of it pretty much not existing. Honestly, you would have probably done less damage if you'd just vacated the belt at this point and left it like that until Chris Benoit won it again in August of 2005, which, well, we suppose that reign would be best left considered vacant as well now. Maybe it would have been better if we just skipped both of those champions then and went straight to Booker T winning it from John Cena, as at least then we wouldn't have such a valley of insignificance and erasure from history in between. But that's not what we got. No, we got Orlando Jordan being put in the same category as former US champions like Harley Race, Terry Funk, and Ric Flair. And that's just not right by anyone's estimation. Still, at least it would never get worse than this, right? Well, while some may argue that's the case, there are others who would argue that our next subject was an even worse champion. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Baron Corbin. Yes, Baron Corbin, a strong contender for worst United States champion ever. And the reason for this is because when he won it, it was at a point in his career when he was at his absolute nadir as a performer. Seriously, back in 2017, there were few people on the WWE roster that screamed Vince McMahon's idea of sports entertainment more than this Kansas native did. After all, he had all the qualities required for the role in that he was big and couldn't wrestle very well. And that was why the boss chose to go all in with him as his next star in waiting by having Corbin defeat Ty Dillinger and AJ Styles of all people at that October's Hell in a Cell pay-per-view to win the strap for the first time. No, you didn't hear us wrong. In a match that featured one of the greatest wrestlers of his generation, arguably one of the best of all time in fact, and another very solid hand in Shawn Spears, WWE chose to go with neither of them as champion and instead run with Baron Corbin. Still, it could have worked out if he had a decent run afterwards, right? Well, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So for the next 70 days after that, we got Corbin working terrible matches against the likes of The Miz, all while fans slept through each encounter. Truly, this was the lowest points when it came to the state of the United States title, as it was so unimportant then, most fans would have actively been happy to see it removed from television. Hell, even when Dolph Ziggler won it from Baron at December 17, 2017's Clash of Champions pay-per-view, he couldn't revive its fortunes. No, it would continue to be a worthless prop all the way up until our next subject won it and carried on this lineage of awfulness. Yes, it's time for us to move on to Bobby Roode. Now, Bobby Roode is a very good wrestler, great even. And this is something which he's proven during his lengthy spell with TNA, where he became a 2-time world champion and 8-time tag team champion. Hell, even once he joined NXT in 2016, he found so much success there that before long he'd be dethroning Shinsuke Nakamura to win their top prize. That said, once he joined the main roster in 2017, all of his fortunes would change, as at that point he began being booked by Vince McMahon. And rather than see him as the potential main eventer he could have been, the boss decided to throw Roode in with the rest of the mid-card division instead. Of course, this instantly made the Canadian feel unimportant then. Unimportant enough to where once he won the vacant US strap on the January 16, 2018 episode of SmackDown, the victory was met with a series of mess from the audience in attendance. Sure, things might have improved for him had he been allowed to have a good run with this in order to reestablish both himself and the belt, but that sadly wouldn't be in the cards, as instead Roode would hold on to the title for the next 54 days, proceed to do absolutely nothing with it in the process, and then drop it to Randy Orton at March 11th's Fastlane. Yes, this was another example of a talented wrestler's attempts to bring some value back to the once prized gold be hampered by bad booking. Yes, it shouldn't have been difficult to have Bobby Roode do something good with the US title. All he had to do was go out there and be given time to have good matches each week, just like Gunther does with the Intercontinental belt today. And the former Beer Money Inc. member isn't the only person who could have added a lot to the lineage of the secondary prize if he'd been allowed to when he'd won it. Sadly though, just as this wouldn't be the case for him, it also wouldn't be the case for Apollo Crews when he snagged the belt in 2020. That's right, it's hard to think of a time in recent history where WWE got such a talented star of the larger wrestling world and then proceeded to fail to get over in any way. After all, while he was working for places like Pro Wrestling Guerrilla and Dragon Gate back in the early to mid 2010s, Wuhan Nation was considered one of the fastest rising performers in the industry. It's such a shame then that once he joined WWE in 2015 and was there repackaged as Apollo Crews, he'd been given absolutely nothing to work with other than to be a guy who smiled a lot and occasionally did an athletic move. And this carried on all the way through his time in NXT and up to the main roster as it happened, with it being once he was on Raw and SmackDown that things reached an all-new level of bad at this point. That's right, after his call-up, Crews spent 4 years between 2016 and 2020 barely even appearing on TV. And whenever he did appear, he'd be part of comedy acts like Titus Worldwide, nothing which allowed him to show off his abilities as a wrestler. And that meant that once he was finally given a run with the US belt in May of 2020, no one cared about him anymore. And because of this, not many fans cared about the run which followed. Yes, throughout his reign, Crews would only work matches on Raw that went 5 minutes or less each week. Therefore, it didn't exactly do much to catch people's attention. So it should come as no surprise that this is another reign which has all but been forgotten about in the years since. But then, we could say the same about all the reigns we've discussed today, as in their own way, they each represent the absolute bottom of the barrel. To win one title in wrestling is a major achievement, but to win 2 titles, well, that just shows you've reached another level altogether. And if you can hold those belts at the same time, then you really are amongst the elite of your era, as very few have ever been able to achieve such a feat. But who are the greatest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the time Becky Lynch became Becky Two Belts in 2019. Now, if there was anyone in 2019 WWE who deserved to get the distinction of being a double champion, it was the man, as at that point in time, she was the undisputed face of the WWE and the biggest star in the entire wrestling industry. How had she done this? Well, by getting massively over with her Stone Cold Steve Austin-inspired anti-hero character. And it was after developing this new gimmick that her road towards the main event of WrestleMania seemed to be inevitable, something fans were all in on. But it wouldn't just be about being part of the first ever women's WrestleMania main event when the time for that match between her, Ronda Rousey, and Charlotte Flair came on April 7th, 2019. No, it was also about taking home all the gold, as this one was for both the Raw and SmackDown women's titles, then held by the baddest woman on the planet and the Queen respectively. That's right, once this one was over and Becky's arm was being raised, she was the new undisputed champion of the WWE Women's Division, or to put it the way she did, Becky Two Belts. Sure, she wasn't the first person from Ireland to use the moniker, but Conor McGregor never looked as cool in a yellow Kill Bill jumpsuit as the man did, so she's got one over on him in that sense. And now that she was the king of all of WWE, at least for a little while, Lynch was able to prove her dominance by taking on all comers, with her holding on to the Raw half of these titles all the way up until she was forced to vacate over a year later, right before she announced to the world that she was pregnant with her first child. But luckily, there was another main event performer who was ready to step up and take her place as the undisputed champ of his division. Sure, it took him a couple of years to get there, as this didn't happen until 2022, but once he won the WWE title and officially became undisputed WWE Universal Champion, Roman Reigns' name was etched in the history books forever. Of course, the reason he's going to go down in history for this run isn't just because he became the first man to unify the two top titles in WWE since Randy Orton did the same in late 2013. No, it's because he's now been champion for over 1,200 days and counting. Yes, the majority of this time, it was just the Universal title he was holding, but even his run as a double champ has been going for almost 650 days at this point. Truly, it's something which hasn't been seen since the heyday of Hulk Hogan, and given the recent news of The Rock's return to WWE, seemingly to challenge Roman at WrestleMania 40, it doesn't look like Cody Rhodes is going to be finishing his story anytime soon. So it doesn't look as if the champ is going to be dropping the belts either. Honestly, it feels like he may very well hold them until at least WrestleMania 41, at which point he'll be the third longest reigning world champion in company history, behind only Bob Backlund and Bruno Sammartino. Could he go even further than that and actually overtake either of those two guys? It might seem like it would be drawing things out way too long, but anything could happen at this point. Lest we remind you that this is the year Vince McMahon sold WWE to Endeavor and CM Punk returned to the company after almost a decade. So buckle up then, because in order to beat Bruno, he'll have to hold on to the belts until at least May 4th, 2028, and that's a long ways away. But even if he does do this, one thing Roman Reigns still won't be able to say is that he was the first ever undisputed champion, the first man to unify both the WWF and WCW world titles. And the reason for that is because this happened in December of 2001 and was pulled off by none other than Chris Jericho. That's right, long before he was making history as the first ever AEW World Champion, Le Champion was beating Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock back-to-back in the same night to take home the two biggest prizes in all of wrestling for his own. And that was a huge deal as it turned out. After all, this was the WCW World title, the one whose lineage went all the way back to George Hackenschmidt, and the WWF World title, the one made so famous by the likes of Bruno Sammartino and Hulk Hogan. No one had ever been able to unify these two prizes before, as up until less than a year prior, the companies had always been separate. Hell, the closest we ever got to such a thing was Ric Flair winning the WWF title in January of 1992 while he was still proclaiming himself to be the real WCW champion. But the truth is that by this point, the Nature Boy had long since been stripped of the ladder strap, and so it's Y2J who will always go down in history as being the first man to ever unify the belts. And that's something which can never be taken away from him. Yes, it's true that the run he had with those titles wasn't the best, but that was bad booking on Vince McMahon's part, not bad wrestling on Jericho's. And even if he didn't have the most memorable match of WrestleMania 18, being double champ at the time meant he got to main event with Triple H, something which would have never happened otherwise at this moment in his career. That's right, for Jericho, and for wrestling history overall, this has to go down as one of the most significant title reigns of all time for all the reasons we've mentioned today, and also because it marked the moment the original Wrestling World title's lineage merged and became part of WWE's. So that meant when our next subject became WWE champion a decade and a half later, then he'd be carrying on that lineage established by the likes of Lou Thesz, Frank Gotch, and Ed Strangler Lewis. That said, just holding one world title wasn't of any interest to Seth Rollins in 2015, and that's when he decided to win the United States title too. How did this situation come about? Well, after cashing in his Money in the Bank contract during the main event of WrestleMania 31 and pinning Roman Reigns to become WWE Champion, the Architect was riding high at the top of the card in the WWE for months. The only person who could threaten his position at all at this point, in fact, was John Cena, as he was having a generational reign with the United States title, using his weekly open challenges to elevate the belt to levels it hadn't seen in decades. So, seeing this and realizing he needed to beat Cena if he wanted to prove once and for all that he was the real top champion in WWE, Rollins had a match with the West Newbury native at that August SummerSlam, with both of their titles being on the line in this one. And in the end, with a little help from a surprising friend in the form of former Daily Show host Jon Stewart, Rollins was able to pin Cena and take home both belts for himself. Obviously then, you could argue this represented the absolute peak of the Davenport boy's career so far, as for a month or so, no one could argue that he wasn't the A player in WWE. Hell, even Roman Reigns felt light years behind him at this point. Even when Rollins lost the US strap back to Cena the following month at Night of Champions, he was able to quickly recover by retaining his world title against Sting, so he came out of that night looking like a superstar regardless of his earlier defeat. In fact, so dominating would he be with the top prize, like with his wife Becky Lynch, it would be outside forces that forced him to ultimately vacate, when a torn ACL he suffered a couple of months later put him on the shelf for the better part of a year. Not that this injury stopped him forever though, because since returning, he's held gold an additional 12 times, with him at one point briefly becoming a double champion again when he held both the Universal title and the Raw Tag Team titles with Braun Strowman. Of course, Seth isn't the only person who's simultaneously been a world and tag team champion in WWE though. No, there's another in the women's division who's done the same. But when we're talking about Asuka, one of the best women's wrestlers on the planet, should this really come as a surprise? Yes, no matter where she's performed in the past, the Empress of Tomorrow has always dominated any ring she's stepped inside. It doesn't matter if it's over in her home country of Japan, where she wrestled for the likes of Pro Wrestling Wave and Ice Ribbon, or in America, where she first truly made her mark out west as the undefeated 510-day-long reigning NXT Women's Champion. So when she was called up to the main roster in 2017 then, it was a given she'd find success eventually, even if she had to overcome Vince McMahon's booking in order to do so. And as it turned out, 2020 was the year she really found her footing on both Raw and SmackDown, as this was the point where, while the rest of the world was having the year from hell, she was beating Sasha Banks to win the Raw Women's title at August 23rd's SummerSlam. But that wasn't all she was doing, because after holding on to this belt for the remainder of the year, Asuka began teaming with Charlotte Flair. And while they were partnering up, the two got a chance to challenge Nia Jax and Shayna Baszler for the women's tag team titles at that December 20th's TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view. Unsurprisingly then, they'd win this one, and with that, the Empress of Tomorrow would officially become a dual champion, a badge of honor she wore for the next month or so as she proceeded to defend both prizes simultaneously. Unfortunately, however, by the time WrestleMania 37 came around, she'd have lost both of her titles and would be forced to start from scratch again right at the bottom. Not that this was too much of a problem for someone of her talents though. No, she just took some time off to recalibrate, then came back stronger than ever, with her currently enjoying a role in one of WWE's best ongoing storylines as part of Damage Control. But not every double champion needs to have a world title to be one of the straps they hold. No, sometimes holding two midcard belts is enough. After all, that's what happened with Kurt Angle in 2000 when he became the Eurocontinental Champion. And yes, Kurt might not have been the first person to unify both the Intercontinental and European belts. No, that came a year earlier when D'Lo Brown did the same thing. However, as great as D'Lo was, his reign wasn't quite as memorable as Kurt Angle's was. After all, it was only mere months after starting his WWE career that the Pittsburgh native swept up every mid-card belt that was available to him. How did he do this? Well, it all started on the February 10th episode of SmackDown that year when Kurt pinned Val Venis to take home the European title. But not content with just holding that, less than a month later at No Way Out, he'd also challenged Chris Jericho for the Intercontinental title and would win this one too, meaning that from there on in, he was dripping with gold. Of course, this came back to bite him in the end because at WrestleMania 16 on April 2nd of that same year, he'd be forced to defend both belts in the same match against Jericho and Chris Benoit, with the first fall being for the IC strap and the second for the European one. And wouldn't you know it, in what Angle would later claim was a conspiracy designed to make him look bad, he'd lose both of his titles on the same night here. But this wasn't a great loss for him in the long run, because his brief time as Intercontinental Champion had already proven to his bosses he could go to a high level. So much so that before the year was out, he'd be defeating The Rock to win the WWF title. And considering he was still less than a year into his in-ring career when this happened, that's quite an achievement. Yes, perhaps no one in the wrestling industry has ever risen quite as high as Kurt Angle did, quite as fast as he did. But that doesn't mean others haven't reached that same level in almost as short a space of time. And if you need any evidence of this, you only have to look to the Ultimate Warrior, and the time he won both the WWF and Intercontinental titles at WrestleMania 6. Sure, he might not have the best of reputations today, but back in the late 80s, the Ultimate Warrior was an absolute phenomenon. A cartoon character come to life who brought a massive jolt of electricity to any arena he was in every time he bolted through the curtain at high speed. So over did he become in such a short space of time. In fact, only a couple of years after his debut in 1987, he was already threatening to overtake Hulk Hogan in terms of popularity with fans. Hell, at this point, Vince McMahon, seeing that the Hulkster was starting to descend from his peak, even began making plans to have the Warrior be the new face of his company going forward. And that was why he had him be the man to finally end the Honky Tonk Man's 454-day Intercontinental title reign at August 28, 1988's SummerSlam. But that wasn't the last of the belts he'd hold, because a couple of years later at WrestleMania 6 on April 1st, 1990, the boss would do something he'd never done before. He'd pit his top two babyfaces against one another. And that meant WWF Champion Hulk Hogan versus Intercontinental Champion The Ultimate Warrior on the grandest stage of them all. Winner takes all. Who won this clash for the ages? The Warrior, of course. And in doing so, he briefly became the holder of both belts at the same time. Why do we say briefly? Well, because only 2 days later, then on-screen WWF President Jack Tunney would force Jim Hellwig to vacate the secondary strap, as he wasn't able to defend both titles simultaneously. Yes, this was a different era of wrestling where things weren't done the same way as they would be today, and so a single person having a stranglehold over all the male singles titles in the company simply wasn't allowed. But that certainly wasn't a problem WWE would have as the years went on, as our video today has shown. And it wasn't a problem WCW had either, because in their dying days, one man would manage to unify both the WCW World title and United States titles. Who are we talking about here? Why, Booker T, of course. That's right, aside from just being the five-time WCW champion, the Houston native also achieved a number of other accolades during his time in Atlanta. More specifically, he'd be a 10-time tag team champion, 6-time television champion, and 1-time United States champion as well. And the way he won the US title was by beating Rick Steiner at March 18, 2001's Greed, the final pay-per-view WCW ever put on, as it came mere days before they were purchased by Vince McMahon and folded into the WWF. That said, this wasn't the only gold Booker would be holding around his waist by the time the company died, as a week later on the final episode of Nitro, he'd pin Rick's brother Scott Steiner to win the WCW World title too. And this gave him the distinction of being the last holder of both the top and secondary prizes while their parent company was still in business. Not that he'd drop them here though. No, with his contract being picked up by Vince McMahon after this, Booker simply carried both titles over to New York with him. Sure, he wouldn't have the US title for long, as he'd gift this to Chris Kanyon on the July 26, 2001 episode of SmackDown. But that was only because he didn't need such a belt anymore. No, like with the Ultimate Warrior before him, he was far too focused on establishing himself as a world champion in this new territory instead. And establish himself he certainly did, as over the years which followed, the creator of the Spinneroonie became one of WWE's top stars at times, especially during his mid-2000s run on SmackDown when he morphed into King Booker. Would this have happened if he hadn't initially gone into the company looking like a superstar with gold draped all over him? Who knows? We can say it certainly didn't hurt his case, just as it didn't hurt Rob Van Dam's overall legacy when in 2006, he became both the WWE and ECW champion simultaneously. But it wasn't just the fact he'd won both belts which made this one so special. No, it was the fact that in order to win the former, RVD would have to beat the face of WWE, John Cena, something very few people did back then. That said, when the time for the match came at July 11th, 2006's One Night Stand pay-per-view, he did have the upper hand somewhat, as the event was taking place in front of an ECW crowd in the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York City. So using this advantage for all it was worth then, Rob took the fight to Big Match John, and in the end, with the help of a well-placed interference spot from Edge, he pinned the champ to take home the belt for himself. Yes, it was a moment fans had been waiting to see since 2001, and now that it had happened in the best possible environment for such a moment to take place, they were overjoyed. But that doesn't explain how Van Dam became ECW champion too, does it? Well, no. In order to explain that, we have to go to the following week's episode of ECW TV, the first episode under the new WWECW banner. And that's because it was there that after coming out to the ring with the belt in tow and receiving a hero's response, RVD was told he was also going to be crowned the new ECW champion too as a result of his big win, with him being given the all-new belt immediately after this. Unfortunately for the Michigan native though, his run as double champ would ultimately be cut short, because only a few weeks into it he'd get busted for smoking weed while driving, and as a result would be suspended by WWE. And as he was still holding both belts at this point, that left the company with no choice but to have him drop each of them hastily, with the WWE title ultimately going to Edge and the ECW title going to The Big Show. Would Mr. Monday Night ever regain his belts after that? No. He'd never be given such a level of trust again, sadly. But none of this should take away from the fact that, if only for a little while, he was able to hold the world titles of two of the top promotions of the 90s simultaneously. And if that isn't enough to make him worthy of the Hall of Fame, then we don't know what is. But RVD isn't the only Hall of Famer who's held multiple titles at once at various points throughout their career, because our next subject did exactly the same in 1997. Sure, this might have been the period when he was at his most insufferable, but that didn't make it any less impressive when Shawn Michaels became both WWF champion and European champion. Hell, it's even more impressive because this was when the European strap was still new, and so it hadn't fallen to the level of becoming a C-tier prize yet. No, back then it still had all the potential in the world to be a top-tier piece of hardware for performers to fight over, and it being held by the then world champion should have only helped add to that potential. Of course, it didn't exactly work out that way in the end, however, as after using his backstage political power to beat the British Bulldog for the belt in front of his home country at September 20th, 1997's one-night-only pay-per-view, Shawn proceeded to do absolutely nothing with it. No, he was far more focused on the world title he was about to win from Bret Hart during the infamous Montreal Screwjob at that November Survivor Series, so he had no time for anything that was secondary by comparison. Hell, the only reason he seemed to want to win it at all was just so Bret's brother-in-law couldn't have it. Does that make this double title reign a failure? We suppose you could say that, but it doesn't change the fact that it was a double title reign regardless, and one which, at least initially, looked like it might make the fledgling European title feel like a big deal. In a prior video, we looked at some of the youngest champions in wrestling history. But what about the flip side to that? What about the people who managed to win some gold while approaching senior citizenship? Yes, being of an advanced age doesn't necessarily make it any less likely for someone to find success inside the squared circle. In fact, it might make it even more likely. But what are the best examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the time Terry Funk became ECW World Champion at the ripe old age of 52. Yes, despite already having had a Hall of Fame-worthy career twice over by that point, in the mid-90s, Terry Funk decided he still had some gas left in the tank and that he wanted to use the remaining time he had left to help get the next generation over. So that was why, throughout this period, he became a regular fixture of the Extreme Championship Wrestling roster, with him using his star power here to help get the fledgling Renegade promotion off the ground. So giving was the Funkster, in fact, he'd make pretty much everyone he went up against look like $1 million. It didn't matter if it was Shane Douglas, Sabu, or Tommy Dreamer. Whenever anyone stepped into the ring with the Amarillo native, they shone brighter than they ever had before. And that was why, as a thank you for all he'd done for the company, on April 13th, 1997 at Barely Legal, ECW's first pay-per-view, Paul Heyman booked the legend to win the promotion's world title from then-champion Raven. Sure, Funk was an old man at this point, so by the strictest of logic, he should have been easy prey for Raven. But then this is wrestling we're talking about, and the unwritten rule is that people only level up more the older they get. And it wasn't as if the fans didn't want to see Terry win the big one anyway. No, he was absolutely beloved by the live crowd in attendance that night, so when he finally scored the winning pinfall, they erupted in an ovation. But not every older champion over the years has received such a positive response from fans. In fact, some have received an outright hostile one by comparison. That said, if you're a heel, then this is the goal at the end of the day. And there's arguably no bigger heel in the world of wrestling than Vince McMahon, particularly during the time he also became ECW World Champion at 61 years old. Now, we will add the caveat here that this wasn't ECW proper. No, this was the bastardized WWECW version, which came about after the success of 2005's One Night Stand pay-per-view. So when we say Vince McMahon was the ECW World Champion at one point in 2007, we can at least say it wasn't really the same belt held by the likes of Taz and Tommy Dreamer. That said, it still counts as a title run, and because of Vince's advanced age when he won the belt, it earns him a spot in this video. Hell, as far as we can tell, this win might actually make him the oldest world champion on record, at least in North America, that is. And the fact that it was the prize once held up as being the shining beacon of the counterculture makes it hurt all the more. But then we suppose that's how the boss wanted us to feel about the whole situation after he pinned Bobby Lashley for it during a 3-on-1 handicap bout pitting him, his son Shane, and Umaga against the Almighty at that April's Backlash show. Of course, this wouldn't be the only time Vince McMahon won a world title though, as almost a decade prior he'd done the same thing in his own company too. Yes, in a truly Vince Russo-esque move, it was back in the autumn of 1999 that the boss pinned Triple H to become the WWF World Champion. But how did such a bizarre moment come about? Well, at that point, Vince was in the middle of a heated feud with the game, one which would soon get even more personal when Stephanie McMahon got involved too. Before that happened though, it was all about the owner of the company trying his best to embarrass his rival by getting the strap he held so dearly off of him. And that's what led to a one-on-one match between the two on the September 16th episode of SmackDown that year, a match which by all rights Triple H should have won with ease. That said, what he wasn't counting on was the fact that Stone Cold Steve Austin had made an uneasy alliance with McMahon at this point, and so as a result, the Rattlesnake was only too happy to get involved and help screw the game out of the victory. That's right, Vince McMahon of all people was now the WWF champion right at the height of the Attitude Era. Sure, he would vacate it the following week, so it wasn't as if he held it for a long time, but it goes down in the record books as a win regardless. Still though, for as old as the boss was here, he wasn't the oldest champion of the turn of the millennium era. No, that's a distinction which goes to only one person, the fabulous Moolah. Yes, at the ripe old age of 76, Moolah would become the WWF Women's Champion. Sure, her place in history was already secured by then anyway, as someone who'd technically been women's champion for decades. In fact, in official WWE canon, she's recognized as having held the original women's title all the way from September 18, 1956 to July 23, 1984, a 10,170-day run which dwarfs anything Bruno Sammartino ever did. That said, for as big of an achievement as this was, arguably the even more impressive achievement was returning to the ring with Mae Young in 1999, right as the Attitude Era was at its peak, and from there, immediately getting involved in a program with then Women's Champion Ivory. And that wasn't all Moolah was doing here. No, she'd actually go so far as to win the belt once more during a one-on-one match against the champ at October 17th's No Mercy pay-per-view, with this victory making her the oldest women's champion of all time. Sure, she would drop the belt again just 8 days later, but like with Vince McMahon, it's not the length of the reign which is important, it's that it happened at all. And that same logic could be applied to our next subject as well as it happens, because despite winning world titles everywhere he went during the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, the last of Ric Flair's reigns with the big gold belt lasted for less than a day, and happened when he was 51 years old. That's right, we're headed into WCW 2000, so strap yourself in because it's about to get stupid. After all, this was the year where the once mighty company's top prize changed hands a total of 25 times, and 6 of those reigns were vacant. So perhaps it's fitting then that the Nature Boy's last go-around with the belt that he helped make famous would be so anticlimactic. And the reason it could be described this way is because it came about as a result of some of the most nonsensical booking ever. Basically, after beating Jeff Jarrett and Scott Steiner in a triple threat match on the May 23rd episode of Thunder to win the belt for the third time himself, Kevin Nash decided he didn't really deserve it. No, as far as he was concerned, the person who really deserved it was Ric Flair, and so that was why he chose to simply give him the title on the following episode of Nitro. Yes, you heard that right. The final world title run in the legendary career of Slick Rick actually happened because he was simply handed the gold. And to make matters worse, he'd lose it later on that same night when he was defeated in a one-on-one bout against Jeff Jarrett. Still, even if it was dumb, it doesn't take away from the fact that the Nature Boy was still technically winning titles into his 50s. And that wouldn't be the last one he won either, because 6 years later, when he was 57, he'd become a WWE World Tag Team Champion with Rowdy Roddy Piper. Of course, you could make the argument this one was even more important for the Memphis native, as Piper had long been a hero of his ever since his early days in the industry. So to get a chance to not only team with him, but become a champion with him, must have felt like a dream come true. How did it happen though? Well, at Cyber Sunday on November 5th, 2006, Flair was booked to challenge then World Tag Team Champions the Spirit Squad with his partner to be chosen by a fan vote. And when the fans voted for Hot Rod himself to be the Nature Boy's teammate, they wasted little time in making short work of their male cheerleader opponents, with the geriatric stars getting both the win and the titles after just 6 minutes and 55 seconds. That's right, it was a special moment for fans who'd grown up watching the two, and it was equally as special a moment for the performers themselves as well. The only thing which could have made it even more special, in fact, was if the yin to Flair's yang in WCW, Sting, was involved. But at that point, he was far too busy working for TNA, the very place he'd later become world champion at 51 years old. Not that this would be the only time Steve Borden became TNA World Champion, however. No, quite the opposite, because during his run there, he'd win the gold a total of 5 times. That said, for the purposes of this video, it's the final reign we want to focus on, the one which came about when, after losing the belt to Mr. Anderson at June 12, 2011's Slammiversary pay-per-view, he'd transform himself into Joker Sting. Who was Joker Sting? Well, he was basically an updated version of the character, one designed to play off of Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Clown Prince of Crime in The Dark Knight. And with this new look and attitude then, the Stinger managed to not only quickly earn himself a rematch against the new champ on the July 14th episode of Impact, but also a victory, as after all was said and done, he'd be holding the belt above his head once more. And what made it all the more impressive he was doing this was by then, he'd firmly entered his 6th decade of life, a period where no one should be athletic enough to stand on top of the world of their chosen sport. But then Sting has never been a normal man, and neither has another of his former WCW peers as it happens, because when it comes to Goldberg, he'd go one better by becoming WWE Universal Champion when he was 53. Now it should be noted that this is a title run which was mired in controversy, as it came at the expense of arguably Bray Wyatt's finest creation, The Fiend. And because of that, it became a tipping point of sorts for many fans who, rightly or wrongly, could only see Bill as the villain in the aftermath of things. Basically, it was in early 2020 that, after almost being ruined again by Vince McMahon's booking, Wyatt had managed to revive himself once more by finally getting his Universal title reign on steady ground, with it being expected he'd be defending this against Roman Reigns at WrestleMania 36. And that's where Goldberg entered the fray, because at the final hurdle before Mania, February 27th Saudi Arabia show Super Showdown, he'd challenged The Fiend for the gold in the main event of the evening. And in a decision no one was happy about, he'd actually go on to win this one, making him the oldest Universal Champion on record. That's right, in what might end up being the former WCW Champion's last run with a top prize, he'd splutter out here, as it quickly became clear live audiences wanted to see Bray in that position instead. After all, there really was no need for Bill to hold the title anymore at this point, especially as his planned bout against Roman Reigns at the Showcase of the Immortals would end up getting cancelled anyway on account of the state of the world in 2020. But even if it wasn't one most fans look back fondly on now, and even if it did serve as a line in the sand for many fans who wanted to see the end of the part-timers coming in and stealing all the glory for younger stars, it's still an achievement nonetheless for Goldberg to have won a world title so far into life. Of course, we're sure if you ask our next subject, he'd say there was nothing special about it though, and that's because he rarely has a nice thing to say about the Georgia native these days. Who are we talking about here? Why, Bret Hart, of course. And the reason we're talking about Bret is because he can also hold a claim to being one of the oldest champions in wrestling history too, as it was on May 17th, 2010 that, against all odds, he became WWE United States Champion at 52 years old. But how did such a thing happen? Especially as the Hitman had long since retired by this point on account of concussion-related injuries. Well, as it turned out, as long as he didn't take any bumps, Bret could still put on something which resembled a wrestling match. And this is what allowed him to step into the squared circle once more that night to take on then-champ The Miz. Of course, even if it was the excellence of execution we're talking about here, given his advanced age and the state of his health, most would still have pegged Mike Mizanin to defeat him. But that wasn't what happened in the end, because in a nice feel-good moment for the live Toronto crowd, after being announced as a surprise opponent, the Hitman caught the champ off guard and went on to tap him out with the sharpshooter in a matter of minutes. That's right, after all those years, and after so many had told him he'd never wrestle again, Bret was technically able to prove them wrong by holding the US title over his head. Sure, it would be a short reign on account of his inability to actually perform in a proper match going forward, but it was still nice to see it happen anyway. So when he was named Raw General Manager the following week, and he took that opportunity to vacate the gold, most were okay with this. After all, getting to see the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be with a title at all anymore was a treat most hadn't expected. And it gave a nice sense of closure for the man who left WWE so bitterly years prior to that, following the events of the Montreal Screwjob. Hell, if nothing else, it served as a better finale for him than his match against Vince McMahon at WrestleMania 26. And it also must have been rewarding for one of his fellow Canadians who'd carried so much guilt about what happened back then, our next subject, the man who famously became WWF Hardcore Champion at the age of 59, and that's Pat Patterson. Yeah, even if him being the first ever Intercontinental Champion is a more important moment historically, that doesn't mean the time Pat Patterson won some gold during the Attitude Era isn't notable in itself. After all, by this point, he was pretty much the oldest person on the roster, and so even stepping in the ring at all anymore was an achievement on his part. Not that the Montreal native was a regular performer in 2000 though. No, he was still effectively retired, with him only appearing in the occasional bout, usually as part of a comedy act with his fellow stooge, Gerald Briscoe. And so limited was he in these matches that you could be forgiven for thinking he was never a full-time wrestler at all. What he most certainly was is back during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he'd traveled all over North America and Japan, with him collecting a treasure trove of gold as he did so. It didn't matter if it was the AWA World Tag Team titles, the NWA United States Heavyweight title, the aforementioned WWF Intercontinental title, or any number of others. Whenever there was a belt on the line, Patterson usually left with it. So perhaps it should come as no surprise then that when he became an on-screen figure once more during the late 90s, it would only be a matter of time until some hardware was around his waist again. After all, even if he was in his 50s, it was still Pat Patterson we were talking about. And as it happened, there was a belt which was perfectly suited for him at this point, one which had been carried for the better part of the prior year by Crash Holly. That's right, the kayfabe nephew of Hardcore Holly had spent much of the first half of 2000 making the WWF Hardcore title relevant by defending it under 24/7 rules, meaning anyone could challenge for it at any time. And that's ultimately what led to Gerald Briscoe taking advantage of this stipulation on the June 19th episode of Raw that year, when he attacked Crash backstage and pinned him in short order. Of course, his fellow stooge Patterson would be right there to celebrate with him once he did so, at least for a few seconds, because after realizing he wanted to hold the title too, the French-Canadian decided to smash a bottle of champagne over the head of the former NWA World Junior Heavyweight Champion, with this giving him the chance he needed to roll him up and steal the belt away for his own. Sure, like with some other reigns we've talked about today, this one would be short-lived, as just a few days later at June 25th's King of the Ring pay-per-view, Pat lost his prized possession during a hardcore evening gown match, pitting him against Briscoe. So it's just as well that this wasn't the last time the inaugural Intercontinental Champion held gold in WWE then. No, over a decade after that, when he was in full-blown senior citizenship at 78 years old, Patterson would become a champion again when he won the spiritual successor to the Hardcore title, the WWE 24/7 Championship. And with this victory then, he'd officially become the oldest person to ever hold a title in New York, and quite possibly in the entire world. But how did it happen? Well, after being booked to appear as a special guest legend on the July 22nd, 2019 episode of Raw, the man who regularly drove them all absolutely banana back during his heyday got one more moment to shine when he ran into then 24/7 champion Drake Maverick and managed to score a quick pinfall win over him. Was it a moment which will go down as being among the greatest of his career? Probably not, but it served as a nice coda anyway, as only a year later Pat would die of liver failure at the age of 79. so given what we know now, it was probably for the best that he got to have one more run with some gold, even if it did only last a matter of minutes before he lost it again. Still, like we said earlier in this video, the length of the title reign isn't what's important in cases like these. No, it's that they happened at all. And while our next entry can't say that they were older than Pat Patterson when they won their final belt, they can say they did it at an age no one would have expected them to. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Chavo Classic, and the time he became WWE Cruiserweight Champion at 55. Hell, not only did he become Cruiserweight Champion here, he actually beat his own son to do so after he pinned him on the May 20th, 2004 episode of SmackDown. And it wasn't like this would be a one-and-done reign either, because following his big victory, Chavo actually went on to defend the belt for a few weeks against the likes of Funaki, Jacqueline, and even John Cena. Really then, considering the fact he was able to do this despite being at a point in life when most people just wanted to have a sit down and a nice drink, it has to rank as one of the most successful late-in-life title reigns of all time. But given we're talking about Chavo Guerrero Sr. here, former NWA World Junior Heavyweight Champion and NWA International Junior Heavyweight Champion, should this really come as a surprise? No, it shouldn't, because when it comes right down to it, there really is no upper age limit on having what it takes to be a successful wrestler. There are a lot of titles in WWE today, 19 to be precise, and this has led to a lot of great reigns with each of these prizes. But just who is the greatest champion of each title? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the WWE title and its greatest holder, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, there are so many people who could have been chosen for this entry. After all, we could have gone for Hulk Hogan, The Rock, John Cena, or even Bruno Sammartino. But in the end, there was only one real choice here, and it was Stone Cold. Come on now, we're talking about the guy whose runs with the Big Eagle carried the company into its second boom period back in the late 90s and pretty much rescued it from going out of business altogether at one point. And even if this hadn't been the case and we were just talking about Steve Austin's run as being during a quieter time for the WWF, it would still rank at the top because it was so entertaining to watch whenever he held it, as that was the run of him memorably feuding with Vince McMahon on Raw every week. Really, so often a booker will book the chase well for a champion, but then forget to give their actual title run a story of its own. Here though, we had one of the best overarching stories to any championship reign in WWE history. One so good it would be copy and pasted again and again as the years progressed with other wrestlers, always to diminishing returns however, because the original could never be topped. That's right, the reality is there might never be anyone who ends up being a better WWE champion than Steve Austin. And that would be fine with us. But the WWE title isn't the only world title today. No, there's also the World Heavyweight title. And the best holder of that particular belt has to be Seth Rollins. Now, when we talk about the World Heavyweight title here, we're talking about the one which was created in 2023 and not the one from the 2000s. No, that one had a different lineage entirely according to the company who created it. So no Triple H, Booker T, or Edge here. No, if it's the new version of the belt we're drawing from, we only have 4 options when determining the best champ. And of those 4, the person who most defined this prize has to be Seth Rollins, partially because he was the first person to hold it. But it's not just because he was the first. No, there's also the fact that with his regular great matches, Seth was able to establish that belt early on as being something more like the workhorse one in comparison to the WWE title, a belt that would be featured on TV more regularly during a time when Roman Reigns was an absentee champion. Yes, it's always important to give a new belt an identity of its own, and this is what the architect was able to do here. Sure, given how young this one is, there's always the chance someone else will come along at some point and have a better reign. Hell, Gunther's making a great attempt at that as we speak. That said, for now, it remains Seth in that spot, and this is a spot he's earned. But what of the women's equivalent, the Women's World Heavyweight title? Well, the GOAT of that belt can be none other than Charlotte Flair. Now again, there are plenty of people we could have chosen for this entry, but in the end, we decided to go with Charlotte as across her many reigns with this particular piece of hardware, she's been able to establish herself as the queen of her division. And considering how many big names there currently are in the WWE Women's division, that's quite an achievement. Yes, more so than a Rhea Ripley or a Sasha Banks, more so than even a Bayley or a Liv Morgan. It's the daughter of Ric Flair who has come to define that belt, as for the most part, it's been her who's held it, most prominently back when it was known as the SmackDown Women's title. In fact, it was Charlotte who carried this belt into the first ever women's WrestleMania main event in 2019, and it's her who holds the current record for winning it the most times, with 7 separate reigns to her name. Really then, there was no way we could go with anyone else here, as she's so tied to its history now and will no doubt continue to be tied to its history going forward. It almost feels like her belt in many ways. But what about the other belt that was a part of that first women's WrestleMania main event? The belt currently known as the WWE Women's title. Well, for our money, the best holder of that is none other than Becky Lynch. Yes, it had to be Becky here. After all, with the lineage of this one only going back to the mid-2010s, it simply couldn't be someone like a Trish Stratus or a Mickie James. No, it could only be the woman who not only served as its inaugural holder, but who also won it in the aforementioned WrestleMania main event. Hell, it could only be the woman who took it to new heights by being the biggest star in the industry while she had it around her waist, a feat no one has been able to achieve since. Honestly, it might seem like too obvious of a choice to say Becky Lynch is the greatest WWE Women's Champ at this point, but that doesn't make the statement any less true. No, the fact is, until someone steps up and does more than she's been able to do, this will always be her belt in spirit. And that's exactly why we expect her to start chasing it once more once she eventually returns to television at some point down the line, possibly even as soon as the night after WrestleMania. After that, she probably wins it again and holds on to it for as long as she cares to, because we've no doubt that in her mind, this is her belt, something which should always be in her possession. Of course, when Becky does return though, she's going to find that there are now more than just world titles in the WWE Women's division. No, there are mid-card belts too. And for one of these, the Women's Intercontinental title, the GOAT has to be Lyra Valkyria. And the reason we say this is because to date, Lyra Valkyria is the only Women's Intercontinental Champion. That's right, with this belt only being introduced in November of 2024, it doesn't exactly have a long lineage quite yet. But that shouldn't suggest Lyra is merely a token winner here. No, even if the Women's Intercontinental strap had been around for a decade by now, there's a chance she still would be the best holder of it, as she's clearly one of the best wrestlers in her division, something which is crucial if we're talking about holding on to a workhorse title. Honestly, we're just curious to see where she goes with it and what heights she can take this new prize to in trying to establish it. Really, what Valkyria has here is an almost blank slate to play with. And that means she can do anything she wants and write the first chapters of its history in the moment, something anyone would be excited to have the chance to do. And while she's doing that, over on SmackDown, the exact same thing will be happening with the greatest women's United States champ, Chelsea Green. Of course, this is another example of there being only one person to choose from because, to date, no one other than Chelsea Green has held this belt. No, since she won it in November of 2024, it's remained around her waist. How has she been working to make it feel important since then? Well, by taking a different route than Lyra Valkyria. Yes, while Lyra has been more focused on the in-ring, Chelsea has made the women's US title about a way only she can, through her comedic segments, as well as some great matches. And that's given this title an identity of its own already, one separate to the women's Intercontinental title over on Raw. Will this be the identity it maintains as the years progress? That remains to be seen. But for now, it's Chelsea who's defined what it is, and her imprint which will remain on it for some time to come, as we don't see her dropping it in the immediate future. No, if anything, we see Chelsea being the Canadian-born champ of the US for a while yet, as she only gets more and more over by the week. But let's move away from the main roster for a moment and down to NXT, as it's there we find our next entry, another mid-card belt, though a men's, the North American title, the best holder of which has to be Wes Lee. Sure, there were many great champs for this one, but in the end we decided to go for Wes Lee. And the reason for that is partially because it was him who helped to revive its fortunes during the early days of the 2.0 era. That's right, over the course of the 269 days he held it, Lee was able to remind people not only why he's a future star in waiting, but why the North American title was so important, as it represented a snapshot of who was going to be the future players over on Raw or SmackDown one day. So great was Wes's reign, in fact, we fully expect that Triple H will remember it when it eventually comes time to book him on the main roster. And maybe this will lead to the game giving the rookie a run with the IC or US straps when the time comes, something his run with the mid-card prize and the developmental brand will have perfectly set him up for. Of course, if he wants to be the best when it comes to the former belt though, he is going to have to earn it, because for our money, the best Intercontinental Champion to date is Gunther. Now, again, it would have been very easy to pick someone from the glory days of this title here, someone like Macho Man Randy Savage, Mr. Perfect, or Bret Hart. Hell, we could have even gone with someone from the late 90s, early 2000s like Steve Austin, Chris Jericho, or Kurt Angle. But while we could have done that, we instead chose to go with someone more modern. And the reason for this is because considering how long the Intercontinental title was dead in the water, it's great that Gunther was able to revive its fortune. That's right, over the course of 600 plus days, the Austrian was able to make this one feel important again, like something which stars such as Sami Zayn and Jey Uso should want to chase. Yes, because of Gunther, now the Intercontinental title has value once more. And of course, it also helps his case that while he was holding it, he was easily having the best matches in WWE because he's Gunther and that's just what he does. Yes, it doesn't matter if we're talking about Drew McIntyre, Sheamus, or any of the other number of opponents the man formerly known as Walter faced off against back when he was the champ, he almost always gave fans something to rave about afterwards. And he did this all in service of making sure the mat remained sacred and the title remained something worth fighting for. But what about the other men's mid-card belt of the WWE main roster, the United States title? Well, the best holder of that couldn't be anyone other than John Cena now. And when we talk about the United States title, we're talking about the WWE lineage, so no Harley Race, Ric Flair, or Roddy Piper. No, the only real option here is the man who truly made it feel like a main event belt in WWE when he held it back in 2015. Hell, it was this reign which gave us so many classic matches and introduced the main roster to so many new stars, as the open challenge format made it possible for people like Kevin Owens to step up to Raw and face off against the champ. Really, you could chart this as the moment that John Cena went from being hated by the adult male audience to being loved by them. And from that point onwards, he's never been hated again. Well, up until he turned heel, that was. But even that heel turn won't take away from how important this reign was in making the US title a valuable prize for a while. So when picking a GOAT of it, we only really had one option. Hell, we haven't even mentioned John's earlier run as United States champion, the one he had back in the early to mid 2000s when he was still in his Doctor of Thugonomics incarnation. It was this which first established him with crowds and set him down a path to eventually becoming the face of the company for the better part of 2 decades. So really, the US strap is tied to Big Match John very strongly, and this only makes his case as being the greatest US champ all the easier to make. Can we say the same about our next entry though, the NXT title? No, that's a much trickier one to pick a GOAT for, but we've chosen to go for Finn Balor. Why Finn Balor over names like Johnny Gargano, Seth Rollins, Adam Cole, and others? Well, because as it stands right now, Balor holds the record for longest combined reigns at 504 days across 2 separate runs. And it's not just the length of these reigns which made them great, no, it's also the matches he had across 2 different periods of NXT's history. Yes, whether it was his first run seeing him go up against people such as Kevin Owens and Samoa Joe, or his second run which saw him return to the black and gold brand to have match of the year contenders against Kyle O'Reilly, Finn never faltered when he was holding that particular piece of hardware. Obviously then, this has made him something of a legend in NXT, and a figure that anyone who holds that belt going forward aspires to be like. But while many have tried, none have managed to better the Irishman yet when it comes to runs on top and developmental. But what about the women? Well, for the greatest NXT women's champ, we have none other than Asuka. Yes, for as great as the NXT women's title reigns of the likes of Sasha Banks, Charlotte Flair, and Bayley all were, none of them were quite as impactful as Asuka's. And the reason for that is because it was Asuka who won it back in April of 2016, and then from there went on to hold it for a total of 510 days without dropping it, a record to this day. Hell, no matter who came up against the Empress of Tomorrow during this period, she'd quickly be dispatched as yet another victim of the champion. So dominating would Asuka be here, in fact, she'd never be beaten for it and would only lose it after vacating due to injury. Yes, going out undefeated certainly strengthens her case here. But what of the mid-card belt of the NXT Women's Division, the NXT Women's North American title? Well, to pick the greatest of that one, we're going to go with Kalani Jordan. Why Kalani Jordan and not someone like Stephanie Vaquer or Fallon Henley, the only other 2 holders of that belt to date? Well, while they're both great in their own ways, neither of them were the first. Yes, this is another example of the person who initially won the title being given the tall task of trying to establish it, a weight which was heavy on the shoulders of Kalani in June of 2024. How would she do with this task? Well, the belt has been firmly established as of 2025, so that tells you everything you need to know right there. That's right, despite still being very young, Jordan was able to add a huge tick in the yes column for her case to future stardom when she won a brand new title and made it important in very short order. In fact, so much is her legacy now tied to this belt, we wouldn't be surprised to see her hold it at least once more before she gets her main roster call-up, and maybe that will vault her towards the NXT Women's title too. One belt it won't be vaulting her towards, however, is one she isn't eligible for, the NXT Heritage Cup. No, that's a men's only prize, and for our money, the best person to hold it has been Noam Dar. Now, the NXT Heritage Cup holds a unique place in the lineage of WWE title belts because this one isn't actually a belt at all, rather it's a cup. A more symbolic trophy to be fought over. And until recently, this one was defended under different rules in that it adopted the old World of Sports style of the round system. Obviously then, this has made it a perfect goal for the more technical worker to go after, and while names like A-Kid and Charlie Dempsey have done a lot with this, it remains Scotland's own Noam Dar who stands out from the pack, as he's the only man to hold the cup on a total of 3 separate occasions. Yes, it's a feat which no one else has been able to achieve, and the reason Dar did so was because he was able to master the old British style so well. But this isn't the only current prize in WWE which has a unique rule set, as the same could be said for our next entry, the men's speed title, and the best person to hold this so far has been Andrade. Now, given how new this belt is, what with it only being introduced in April of 2024, there weren't a lot of options to choose from when choosing the best for the men's speed title. But for those who have been tuning into Speed on Twitter over the last year, you may have seen a fun match or two, one which would have been brief by its very nature, as the rule of this belt is that it's contested over in 3-minute bouts. But as it turns out, Andrade only needs 3 minutes to get the job done. And that was why he was able to beat inaugural champ Ricochet for the prize in June of 2024, not long after he returned to WWE. And from that point onwards, he'd hold on to the Speed Championship for a total 141 days, regularly defending it in short matches on Twitter throughout this reign. Sure, like with other new titles, there's always the chance that someone will come along and have a better reign as time progresses, but for now we're calling Andrade the greatest of the men's speed division. But what of the women? Yes, a female equivalent of that title would also be introduced in October of 2024. And when it comes to who the GOAT of that belt is, well, it could only be one person, Candice LeRae. Of course, like with the Women's Intercontinental and United States Championships, the reason there can only be one choice here is because there's only been one person to hold it. That's right, ever since becoming the inaugural Women's Speed Champion less than a year ago, Candice LeRae has yet to drop it. But then this should be expected given how much experience she has in the ring, and how great she's been just about everywhere she's performed in the past. And she's certainly learned this new style quickly, because after beating the living legend that is Io Sky to make history as the first champ, there really hasn't been anyone who's come close to beating her yet. Yes, at the rate Candice is currently going at, she could be Women's Speed Champion for a long time to come. But let's move away from singles belts for now and over to tag team belts instead, as there are plenty of them in WWE at the moment. And perhaps the most prized of all would be the WWE tag team titles. Who are the greatest champs here? Who else but the Usos? Now, there have obviously been a lot of great tag teams to appear in WWE over the years. Even in the present day, duos like DIY and the Motor City Machine Guns have been keeping the flag of tag team wrestling alive on SmackDown, where these particular belts are currently fought over. But neither of those are the ones we're going with as the greatest champs. No, that honor could only go to the duo made up of Jimmy and Jey Uso. Why is this? Well, ever since the lineage of these prizes began back in September of 2016, they've been completely synonymous with them, holding them a total of 5 times. And one of those reigns just so happens to be a record setter, as it lasted for 622 days and saw them be unified with the other set of tag titles over on Raw. So there could be no one else we could choose here other than the Usos, as they're so much of what tag team wrestling has been in WWE over the last decade or so. Sure, they may not be partners right now as of the time of this video's recording, but we expect that they will team up again before all is said and done once more and win the gold. The only question is whether it'll be these belts or the other ones they snag, the World Tag Team titles, the ones whose current greatest champion are the New Day. Again, this one seemed like an obvious choice because while the World Tag Team titles have been held by a lot of great duos ever since they were first introduced back in October of 2002, we're talking about teams like The Shield, the Dudley Boys, or just about any combination of the SmackDown 6 you can think of. None of those pairings have anything on the trio then made up of Big E, Kofi Kingston, and Xavier Woods. No, if the Usos have been the #1 tag team in WWE over the last 20 years, then the New Day have been 1A, and so much of their legacy has been tied to the World Tag Team titles. After all, it's those belts they held a total of 4 times while all 3 men were still in the group. And it's those belts they at one point carried around their collective waists for a full 484 days, what was at the time a record-setting title reign in length. Hell, we fully expect that even if they are now a duo, Xavier and Kofi will go on to hold these again at some point and only further solidify their case to be the best to ever hold those belts. Or who knows, maybe they'll choose to go after another set of tag titles instead, a set of belts that they once held briefly and which give the tag team division on NXT something to fight over. Of course, these belts are the NXT tag team titles, and when it comes to the best team to ever hold them, well, that would have to be the Revival. Yes, they might be better known today as FTR, but back in the mid-2010s, the duo made up of men then known as Scott Dawson and Dash Wilder was still coming to grips with being a team, and that's because they'd only just been put together by Triple H. Luckily for them, though, they quickly found they had instant chemistry together. And it also helped them that they were around right as the NXT tag division was about to explode in quality, what with teams such as DIY, American Alpha, and the War Raiders also rising to the forefront here. Of course, for as great as those other teams were, though, none were quite as good as the Revival. And that's because with their throwback style, they felt like the second coming of the Brainbusters or the Midnight Express, a true classic duo who knew exactly how to maximize everything they did in a tag team setting. But what about the women? They have a tag division in WWE too, right? Why, yes they do, and they also have their own set of titles. But who are the greatest when it comes to the WWE Women's Tag Team titles? Well, that could only be the Boss and Hug Connection. Yes, this was the duo that had been campaigning WWE for years to create women's tag belts, something which largely led to them being introduced in 2019. And not only were Sasha and Bayley the inaugural champions, but they'd also go on to hold the belts again in 2020 for a second reign, with the duo being one of the few bright spots during the Thunderdome era. But then when we're talking about Sasha Banks and Bayley, being great is just another day at the office, just as it is for every other performer we've looked at today, because they've each shown that if you can tie yourself to one belt strongly enough, then your legacy will be set forever.